66 million years ago, in what we now know as the Yucatan Peninsula, the sky tears apart. An asteroid 12 kilometers in diameter, a mountain-sized rock traveling at 70,000 kilometers per hour, collides with Earth's surface with a force equivalent to 10 billion Hiroshima bombs. In less than a second, a crater 180 kilometers wide forms. The ocean vaporizes, rock liquefies, and a wave of fire expands in all directions, incinerating every living thing for thousands of kilometers. The dinosaurs, who had reigned for 160 million years, watched the sky turn blood red for the last time. But what comes next, what emerges from the ashes of that apocalypse, defies all logic. Because from that absolute devastation, from that world reduced to rubble and darkness, something unexpected will arise. You will arise. Imagine for a moment that you could travel through time, that you could go back 66 million years and witness the last days of the Cretaceous. The first thing you would notice would be the heat. A global temperature, several degrees higher than today, keeps the poles practically free of ice. The continents have strange, unrecognizable shapes. The Atlantic Ocean is barely a narrow channel compared to its current extent. India sails alone toward the north, not yet having collided with Asia to form the Himalayas. And on this hot, fragmented Earth, dinosaurs dominate every ecosystem. Tyrannosaurus rex stalks through what is now North America. Triceratops grazes in herds that make the ground tremble. Pterosaurs with 10-meter wingspans soar through skies that no human aircraft has ever crossed. But look closer, because between the legs of these colossi, hidden in burrows and crevices, scurrying at night to avoid being devoured, exist tiny creatures. They are small, most no larger than a modern squirrel. They have fur, warm blood, and feed their young with milk. They are the mammals, and they have been coexisting with dinosaurs for more than 150 million years, always relegated to the shadows, always on the margins of the main spectacle of life on Earth. No one, absolutely no one, would bet on them to inherit the planet. Now, speed up time. Watch the sky on the day everything changed. First, it appears as a bright star, then as a second moon, then as a sun that grows and grows until it fills the horizon. The impact at Chicxulub triggers a cascade of apocalyptic events that scientists have reconstructed with chilling precision. The initial shockwave travels at the speed of sound, flattening entire forests as if they were straws. Simultaneously, incandescent rock fragments are ejected into the atmosphere, some reaching outer space before falling back to Earth as a global rain of fire. In the following hours, the entire planet burns. The conifer forests that covered North America turn to ash. The wildfires release more carbon dioxide in days than humanity has emitted in its entire history. But the fire is only the beginning. What really kills the Mesozoic world is the darkness. Billions of tons of dust and soot rise into the stratosphere, forming an opaque layer that blocks sunlight for months, perhaps years. Temperatures plummet, photosynthesis stops, plants die. The herbivores that depended on them die, the carnivores that depended on the herbivores die. It is a chain collapse of the global food web, and it happens with brutal speed. Paleontologists estimate that approximately 75% of all species on the planet went extinct during this event. All non-avian dinosaurs disappeared forever. So did the pterosaurs, the mosasaurs that dominated the oceans, the ammonites that had swum in the seas for 300 million years. It was, without a doubt, one of the worst days in the history of life on Earth. Yet some survived. And this is where the story becomes truly extraordinary, because the survivors were not necessarily the strongest, nor the largest, nor the best adapted. They were, in many cases, the smallest, the most generalist, those who could hide underground, those who could eat anything. They were the opportunists, the marginalized, those no one would have chosen as heirs to the planet. Among them were the mammals. But other groups we often forget, also survived. Crocodiles, which had coexisted with dinosaurs for more than 200 million years, crossed the boundary from the Cretaceous to the Paleocene practically unchanged. Their slow metabolism, their ability to go months without eating, their tolerance for extreme conditions allowed them to resist where dinosaurs fell. Turtles also survived, as they had through all previous mass extinctions. There is something in the biology of these reptiles, a fundamental resistance to adversity, that has allowed them to persist through catastrophes that destroyed apparently more successful creatures. Amphibians, those ancient creatures that had been the first vertebrates to conquer dry land 300 million years earlier, also crossed the crisis. The frogs, salamanders, and caecilians we know today descend from lineages that survived the impact. Their aquatic life cycles, their ability to bury themselves in mud and enter prolonged states of dormancy, were crucial advantages during the years of darkness. And birds. We must not forget that birds are dinosaurs. They are theropods, the same group that included Tyrannosaurus rex and Velociraptor. When we say dinosaurs went extinct, we are being imprecise. Non-avian dinosaurs went extinct, but a branch of small, feathered theropods capable of flight managed to survive. And from that branch descend the more than 10,000 species of birds we know today. It is fascinating to wonder why birds survived when their dinosaur cousins perished. Part of the answer seems to lie in size. Birds of the late Cretaceous were generally small, and small animals have advantages in times of crisis because they need fewer resources to survive. Another part of the answer might lie in their diet. Many birds that survived appear to have been granivorous, capable of feeding on seeds that could persist buried in the soil during the years of darkness. Non-avian dinosaurs, many of which depended on fresh vegetation or on prey that in turn depended on fresh vegetation, did not have that resource. But let us return to the mammals, because they are the ones who will inherit the Earth. Now imagine the world 1 year after the impact. The dust clouds begin to dissipate. A grayish, dim light illuminates devastated landscapes. The forests are charred skeletons. Rivers carry ash and corpses. The silence is absolute, disturbing. Where once the roars of dinosaurs resonated, now there is only wind and the creaking of burned wood. It is a world of ghosts, a planet that seems to have died. But it has not. Underground, in burrows that served as shelters against the surface inferno, small furry creatures begin to poke out their snouts. They blink at the strange light. They sniff the ash-laden air. And slowly, with a caution engraved by millions of years of evolution as prey, they emerge into an unrecognizable world. A world where all their predators have vanished. A world where the ecological niches that had been occupied for 160 million years are now empty. It is as if you had lived your entire life in a tiny apartment, sharing the building with violent giants who forced you to constantly hide, and suddenly, one day, you wake up and all the giants are dead. The entire building is empty. Every room, every floor, every corner is available. You can go wherever you want. You can be whatever you want. This is exactly what happened to mammals 66 million years ago, and what they did with that opportunity would define the next 66 million years of Earth's history. It would define the world we live in today. It would define you. Welcome to the Cenozoic, the age of mammals. The Paleocene, the first chapter of this new era, begins among ashes and ends with an explosion of life. It spans approximately 10 million years, from the asteroid impact 66 million years ago until about 56 million years ago. It is a period of recovery, of experimentation, of filling the voids left by the extinct. During the first hundreds of thousands of years, Earth slowly heals. Ferns, those ancient plants capable of colonizing devastated terrain, are the first to return. Paleontologists have found a distinctive layer in the fossil record known as the fern spike. a stratum where fern spores absolutely dominate, an unmistakable sign of a post-apocalyptic world where the simplest plants reconquer the land before the more complex ones. Gradually, forests return, but they are not the Cretaceous forests. The conifers that had dominated lose ground to flowering plants, the angiosperms, which prove to be more resilient and adaptable. The early Paleocene forests are more diverse, more colorful, more fruitful in the literal sense of the word. And in these reborn forests, mammals begin their transformation. During the first million years of the Paleocene, mammals remain small. Most do not exceed 10 kilograms, but they are no longer hiding, they are no longer constant prey. Now they can explore, experiment, diversify, and they do so with a speed that astonishes paleontologists. The first medium-sized mammals appear, creatures like Peripticus, an animal the size of a medium dog with specialized teeth for grinding hard plants, or Ectoconus, slightly larger, with a robust body adapted for an omnivorous diet. These animals are clumsy by modern standards, with small brains and heavy bodies, but they represent something revolutionary. Mammals occupying ecological niches that had belonged to dinosaurs for 160 million years. One of the most successful groups of the early Paleocene were the condylarths, a term that modern paleontologists consider problematic because it groups animals that were probably not closely related. But to understand the Paleocene, we need to talk about them. Condylarths were small to medium-sized mammals, generally omnivores, with relatively generalized anatomies. They were not specialists in anything, but they were competent at many things, and that flexibility was key to their success. From condylarths, or from animals similar to them, probably descend many of the herbivorous mammal groups that would dominate the continents in later epochs. The ancestors of horses, rhinoceroses, elephants, pigs, hippopotamuses, all probably have their roots in these unspecialized Paleocene animals. Another group that flourished during the Paleocene were the multituberculates. These mammals, whose teeth had characteristic multiple cusps, had existed during the Mesozoic, coexisting with dinosaurs. In fact, they had been one of the most successful mammal groups of the Mesozoic, and they survived the extinction to continue thriving for millions of years more. Multituberculates occupied ecological niches similar to those of modern rodents, although they were not related to them. They ate seeds, fruits, leaves. They lived in trees and on the ground. They were small, agile, adaptable, but multituberculates would eventually be replaced by true rodents, which appear toward the end of the Paleocene. Rodents proved to be superior competitors, with their continuously growing incisors and their extraordinary reproductive capacity. By the Eocene, multituberculates would be in decline. By the Oligocene, they would have completely disappeared. But during the Paleocene, they were major players in ecosystems around the world. But the true diversification happens in the shadows, where mammals have always thrived. Insectivores multiply into dozens of species. The first primates appear, small creatures with large eyes adapted to nocturnal life in the trees. The ancestors of rodents begin their silent conquest that continues to this day. The first Paleocene primates deserve special attention because from them we will eventually descend. Creatures like Purgatorius, known from fragmentary fossils from Montana and Canada, lived in the early Paleocene forests. They were small, probably the size of a squirrel, with fingers adapted for grasping branches and forward-facing eyes for judging distances. They ate insects and fruits. They were not very different from the modern tree shrews of Southeast Asia. But in Purgatorius and its relatives, we can already see the seeds of what was to come. The stereoscopic vision that allows us to perceive depth. The prehensile hands that would eventually allow us to make tools. The varied diet that would select for intelligence and behavioral flexibility. It all begins here, in the Paleocene forests, with creatures that would fit in the palm of your hand. One of the most extraordinary creatures of this period is the Taeniodont. This name may mean nothing to you, but imagine an animal the size of a small bear, with enormous claws and teeth that grew continuously throughout its life. Daniodonts dug in search of roots and tubers, a completely new ecological niche that no mammal had exploited before. They were, in a sense, the first professional diggers of the mammalian world. Meanwhile, in South America, something extraordinary happens. This continent, isolated from the rest of the world by vast oceans, becomes an independent evolutionary laboratory. Here, a group of mammals known as South American native ungulates begins its own evolutionary radiation, completely separate from what is happening in the north. They will develop forms that mimic horses, elephants, rabbits, but without being related to any of them. It is convergent evolution on a continental scale, and it will produce some of the strangest creatures that have ever walked the earth. In the oceans, the transition is equally dramatic. Mosasaurs and plesiosaurs have vanished. Sharks survived the extinction event, but the great marine predators of the Mesozoic are gone. For now, the seas are relatively empty of large vertebrates, but this will change. In ways no one could predict, some terrestrial mammals will look toward the ocean and decide to return to the water. But that story will come later. As the Paleocene progresses, Earth warms progressively. Carbon dioxide levels are significantly higher than today, and the greenhouse effect maintains elevated global temperatures. Tropical forests extend to surprising latitudes. Palm trees grow in what is now Wyoming. Crocodiles inhabit the coasts of Greenland. It is a greenhouse world, a planet without polar ice, warmer than it has been at any point in human history. This heat has profound consequences for mammalian evolution. Warm, humid environments favor rapid metabolism, accelerated reproduction, swift diversification. Paleocene mammals, though primitive by modern standards, are laying the foundations for everything that will come after. Toward the end of the Paleocene, approximately 56 million years ago, something happens. Something that will change everything once again. But this time, it will not be an asteroid. It will be something that emerges from the very bowels of the Earth. It is called the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, and it is one of the most extreme climatic events in our planet's history. Scientists abbreviate it as PETM, and its study has become extraordinarily relevant in our era of anthropogenic climate change. Imagine the scenario. Earth is already warm, significantly warmer than today. Atmospheric carbon dioxide levels are already several times higher than current levels. There is no permanent ice at either pole. Tropical forests extend to latitudes that are tundra today, but then, in a geologically instantaneous period of a few thousand years, global temperatures spike an additional 5 to 8 degrees Celsius. The oceans warm from the surface to the abyssal depths. Ocean currents are altered. Ecosystems around the planet enter crisis. To put this in perspective, current global warming has raised temperatures approximately 1 degree Celsius since the pre-industrial era. Scientists warn that a warming of 2 degrees would have severe consequences. The PETM saw a warming of 5 to 8 degrees in a comparable time period. It was extreme climate change, faster and more intense than anything humanity has experienced. Scientists still debate what exactly caused this extreme warming. The most accepted hypothesis involves a massive release of methane, a greenhouse gas much more potent than carbon dioxide. This methane could have come from methane hydrate deposits on the ocean floor, destabilized by initial warming. Methane hydrates are crystalline structures where methane becomes trapped in ice cages at low temperatures and high pressures. They are found in enormous quantities in deep ocean sediments. If they warm enough, they release their methane into the atmosphere. And if enough methane is released at once, it can trigger additional warming that releases more methane in a devastating feedback loop. Another hypothesis involves massive volcanic activity in what is now the North Atlantic. The separation of Europe and North America produced enormous eruptions that could have released significant quantities of greenhouse gases. Or it could have been a combination of both factors, with volcanism initiating a warming that destabilized methane hydrates. Whatever the cause, the result was devastating. In the oceans, acidification wiped out much of the plankton with carbonate shells. Benthic foraminifera, small organisms that lived on the ocean floor, suffered a mass extinction from which they took hundreds of thousands of years to recover. Warmer water contained less dissolved oxygen, creating dead zones in the oceans where life could not thrive. The ocean acidification during the PETM was particularly severe. When carbon dioxide dissolves in seawater, it forms carbonic acid, lowering the pH and making it harder for organisms to build shells and skeletons from calcium carbonate. The shells of foraminifera, the microscopic organisms whose fossils tell us so much about past climates, dissolved in the acidic waters. In some oceanic sediments, the layers deposited during the PETM are notably devoid of calcium carbonate, a testament to how corrosive the oceans had become. The terrestrial record is equally dramatic. Soils from the PETM show distinctive chemical signatures indicating rapid changes in temperature and precipitation. Fossil leaves from this period have smaller stomata, the pores through which plants breathe, an adaptation to the elevated carbon dioxide levels. Plants were responding in real time to the changing atmosphere, just as they are responding to human-caused changes today. Scientists have calculated that the carbon release during the PETM was roughly comparable to what would happen if humans burned all available fossil fuels. The PETM thus serves as a natural experiment, showing us what happens when large amounts of carbon enter the atmosphere quickly. The answer is sobering. Widespread extinction in the oceans, massive migration and ecosystem disruption on land, and a recovery that took hundreds of thousands of years. But there is one crucial difference between the PETM and modern climate change. The carbon release during the PETM occurred over thousands of years. Modern carbon emissions are happening over centuries, 10 times faster. If the PETM caused such disruption over millennia, what will happen when we compress the same change into a tenth of the time? We do not know, but the geological record suggests we should be concerned. On land, ecosystems completely reorganized. Species migrated toward the poles in search of tolerable temperatures. Tropical forests expanded to latitudes that had previously been temperate. Those species that could not migrate or adapt went extinct. Yet remarkably, mammals as a group thrived during and after the PETM. Many lineages actually diversified, taking advantage of the new conditions. The extreme warmth opened new habitats, created new opportunities, and accelerated evolutionary change. Mammals emerged from the PETM more diverse and more widespread than before. But for some, chaos was an opportunity. The Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum functioned as a temporary land bridge. The extreme warming allowed tropical forests to extend to the Arctic, creating corridors of continuous vegetation between continents that would normally be separated by tundra or ice. And through these corridors, animals migrated. It is during this period that the ancestors of horses, modern primates, and artiodactyls suddenly appear in the fossil record of North America and Europe. They did not evolve there. They migrated from Asia, taking advantage of the land connections of the greenhouse world. It was one of the greatest reorganizations of terrestrial fauna since the extinction of the dinosaurs. And so we arrive at the Eocene. If the Paleocene was convalescence, the Eocene is the party. It is the period where mammals truly explode in diversity and size, where the first giants appear, where evolution's strangest experiments walk upon the Earth. The Eocene begins about 56 million years ago and extends until about 34 million years ago. During these 22 million years, the planet remains warm, although temperatures gradually decrease after the peak of the thermal maximum. Tropical and subtropical forests dominate much of the land masses. The poles, though cooler than the equator, remain habitable places, very different from the ice we know today. In this greenhouse world, mammals reach sizes that would have been unthinkable barely 10 million years earlier. But before talking about the giants, we must understand the stage where they lived. Eocene forests were radically different from modern forests. Imagine tropical jungles extending from the equator to Greenland. Imagine crocodiles swimming in Arctic rivers. Imagine palm trees growing where there are glaciers today. The Eocene was the peak of Cenozoic warming, a world so warm it defies our imagination. Oxygen isotope analyses in foraminifera fossils allow us to reconstruct past ocean temperatures with surprising precision. During the early Eocene, deep ocean waters were 10 to 15 degrees warmer than today. Surface waters in the Arctic reach temperatures of 23 degrees Celsius, similar to a modern tropical sea. There was no ice anywhere on the planet. In this overheated world, biological productivity reached extraordinary levels. Forests grew faster. Animals could find food year-round, without the seasonal restrictions that limit life at high latitudes today. It was a world of abundance, and that abundance was reflected in the diversity and size of mammals. Imagine the Eocene jungles of what is now Wyoming. The vegetation is dense, lush, more similar to the current Amazon than to the prairies we know. Among the trees moves a creature that seems out of a nightmare. It is 13 meters long. Its body is thick as a tree trunk. Its relatively small head houses jaws capable of swallowing a whole deer. It is Titanoboa, the largest snake that ever existed. But we must make an important correction. Titanoboa actually lived during the late Paleocene, not the Eocene proper, in what is now Colombia. However, its existence tells us about the conditions of the greenhouse world that characterized the Paleocene-Eocene transition. Titanoboa weighed more than 1,000 kilograms. Some estimates suggest up to 1,400. To put this in perspective, the modern green anaconda, the heaviest snake in today's world, rarely exceeds 200 kilograms. Titanoboa was 5 to 7 times more massive. Its existence was only possible in a world of extreme temperatures. Because snakes are ectotherms, they depend on ambient heat to maintain their metabolism. Scientists' calculations suggest Titanoboa needed average temperatures of at least 30 degrees Celsius to survive, possibly 34. The greenhouse world of the late Paleocene and early Eocene provided exactly that environment. Titanoboa was probably an aquatic ambush predator, similar to modern anacondas but on a much larger scale. It fed on giant fish and crocodiles, and its fossils have been found alongside those of turtles the size of dining tables. The Cerrejón ecosystem in Colombia, where Titanoboa was discovered, was a tropical wetland where reptiles had assumed the role of megafauna in a world where mammals had not yet reached large sizes. But do not be fooled into thinking Titanoboa was the only monster of its era. In the same ecosystems lived the Gastornis, formerly known as Diatryma. These were not snakes, they were birds. But birds unlike any you have ever seen. They measured 2 meters tall, had enormous beaks capable of cracking bones, and had completely lost the ability to fly. Their anatomy tells us a fascinating story about evolution. Gastornis had massive muscular legs, clearly adapted for walking and running rather than perching on branches. Its beak was enormous, with a depth that suggests powerful jaw muscles. Its wings were reduced to small stumps useless for flight. For decades, scientists imagined them as fierce predators, the avian heirs of predatory theropods. Artistic representations showed them chasing and devouring small early mammals. However, recent research has revealed something surprising. They were probably herbivores. Analyses of the chemistry of their bones suggest a plant-based diet. The anatomy of their beaks, though impressive, is more consistent with cracking hard nuts and seeds than tearing flesh. Their claws were not curved like a predator's, but rather blunt, appropriate for walking on the forest floor. This revelation changes our picture of the Eocene in fundamental ways. It reminds us that evolution does not follow predictable patterns, that giant non-predatory birds can coexist with monstrous snakes, that ecosystems of the past were as complex and surprising as those of the present, if not more so. It also reminds us how difficult it is to interpret extinct animals from fossilized bones. Our first impressions are frequently wrong. Meanwhile, in the Eocene oceans, something extraordinary is happening. Something that will eventually produce the largest animals that have ever existed. The story of cetaceans, whales, and dolphins is one of the most extraordinary in all the evolution of life, and it deserves that we stop to explore it in detail. About 50 million years ago, on the coasts of what is now Pakistan, lived a creature called Pakicetus. At first glance, it did not seem like anything special. It was the size of a wolf, had 4 legs, fur, and spent most of its time on dry land. It hunted small animals on the shores of rivers and lagoons, occasionally entering the water to chase fish or flee from predators. But if you observed its skull, you would notice something peculiar. The structure of its ears, specifically the tympanic bone, showed a unique configuration found only in cetaceans. It was designed to hear underwater. The position of its eyes, adapted for stalking prey in aquatic environments, also suggested an affinity with the aquatic medium. Pakicetus was a terrestrial mammal that was beginning to look toward the ocean. Scientists long wondered from which group of terrestrial mammals whales descended. Hypotheses varied enormously. Some thought they were related to ungulates, others to carnivores, others to extinct groups with no modern relatives. The answer came from molecular genetics and fossils like Pakicetus. Whales are artiodactyls, the same group that includes pigs, hippos, deer, cows, and camels. In fact, their closest living relative is the hippopotamus. This means that whales and hippos share a common ancestor that lived about 60 million years ago, and that both lineages independently developed their aquatic adaptations. We do not know exactly what drove Pakicetus's ancestors toward the water. Perhaps it was competition with other terrestrial predators. The early Eocene saw a diversification of carnivorous mammals, and a medium-sized animal like Pakicetus might have found a safer niche in aquatic environments where terrestrial predators could not follow. Perhaps it was the abundance of fish and other marine resources that were not being efficiently exploited by any mammal. Perhaps it was simply evolutionary chance, a mutation here, an adaptation there, that resulted in individuals slightly more comfortable in water leaving more descendants than their terrestrial cousins. What we do know is that this tentative step toward the ocean would trigger one of the most extraordinary transformations in the history of life. In a few million years, Pakicetus's descendants became increasingly aquatic. Ambulocetus, the walking whale, which lived about 49 million years ago, could both walk on land and swim like a giant otter with crocodile jaws. It measured about 3 meters long and weighed perhaps 300 kilograms. Its hind legs were powerful, useful both for walking and propelling itself in water. Its tail was probably thick and muscular, beginning to show the adaptations that would eventually produce the horizontal tail fluke of modern whales. Ambulocetus was probably an ambush predator, waiting in shallow waters for unsuspecting prey to come close enough. Rhodhocetus, from about 47 million years ago, represents the next step. It had reduced hind limbs and a pelvis that was no longer firmly connected to the spine, an adaptation that allowed greater flexibility for swimming. Its tail was longer and flattened. Rhodhocetus was clearly more aquatic than its ancestors, but probably could still move awkwardly on land. Dorudon, from about 40 million years ago, was already completely aquatic. It measured about 5 meters long and had a fusiform body, perfectly adapted for marine life. Its forelimbs had become flippers. Its hind limbs were tiny, barely visible externally, completely useless for locomotion but still present as vestiges of its terrestrial past. Dorudon swam through undulations of its spine and tail. Like modern whales, it never set foot on dry land. And then came Basilosaurus. The name means king lizard, a mistake by early paleontologists who confused it with a marine reptile when they discovered its first fossils in Louisiana in the 1830s. But Basilosaurus was not a lizard. It was a whale, an 18-meter-long whale, some specimens possibly reaching 20 meters, with a serpentine body and teeth designed to tear flesh. It was the first great cetacean predator, occupying the ecological niche that mosasaurs had left vacant 30 million years earlier. Imagine encountering Basilosaurus in the Eocene oceans. Its body undulates through the water with sinuous movements, more similar to an eel's than a modern whale's. Unlike current whales, which propel themselves mainly with vertical tail movements, Basilosaurus probably swam with lateral undulations of its entire elongated body. Its jaws, armed with sharp teeth, can catch sharks, fish, other marine mammals. Basilosaurus fossils are sometimes found with bones of other smaller cetaceans in their stomachs. It was the supreme predator in an ocean that had not yet seen anything similar since the extinction of mosasaurs. But here is what is truly astonishing. Basilosaurus still had hind legs, tiny, barely 60 centimeters long, in an 18-meter animal, completely useless for locomotion, but present. They were the evolutionary memory of its terrestrial ancestors, living proof that this marine monster descended from creatures that once walked on dry land. Scientists debate the function of these small limbs. Some suggest they might have served as hooks during mating. Others think they simply had not had time to completely disappear, that evolution had not yet finished eliminating them. In barely 15 million years, cetaceans had gone from being wolf-sized terrestrial mammals to being the largest predators in the oceans. It is one of the fastest and most dramatic evolutionary transformations we know of, comparable only to the evolution of bats or the transitions of tetrapods from water to land. And it happened during the Eocene, in this greenhouse world where everything seemed possible. Back on dry land, the Eocene saw the appearance of the first recognizable members of many modern mammal groups. The history of some of these lineages has become classic examples of evolution taught in schools around the world. The first equids, the ancestors of horses, appeared in the form of Eohippus, also known as Hyracotherium. This creature looked nothing like a modern horse. It was the size of a fox, weighing barely about 20 kilograms, with a shoulder height of about 30 centimeters. It had 4 toes on the front feet and 3 on the back, each ending in a small, separate hoof, very different from the single hoof that defines modern horses. Its back was arched, not straight. Its teeth had low crowns, adapted for nibbling tender leaves and fruits instead of chewing abrasive grass. It is almost impossible to look at Eohippus and see in it the potential for the Arabian horse, the racing thoroughbred, the Clydesdale pulling beer carts. And yet, there it was, hidden in its genes, waiting for the right environmental conditions to manifest. The evolution of horses, which we will follow over millions of years, is one of the best documented stories in the fossil record, with fossils showing almost every step of the transformation. Natural history museums frequently display series of skulls and leg bones, showing the gradual increase in size, the reduction of toes, the lengthening of limbs. It is visual evidence of evolution in action, and it begins here, in the humid Eocene forests, with an animal that would fit comfortably under a dining table. The first proboscideans, the group that includes modern elephants, also appeared during the Eocene. Moeritherium, from Egypt, was the size of a large pig, weighing perhaps 200 kilograms. It had no trunk in the sense we know it, only a slightly elongated and mobile upper lip. Its tusks were small, barely visible. It probably spent much time in the water, like a hippopotamus, feeding on aquatic plants on the banks of rivers and lakes. Looking at Moeritherium, it is hard to imagine that this chunky, semi-aquatic animal would give rise to the majestic African and Asian elephants, to the woolly mammoths of the Ice Ages, to the mastodons that roamed the forests of North America. But in its anatomy, one could already see the foundations of what would eventually become the largest land animal of the modern world. The structure of its teeth, the configuration of its facial bones, certain details of the skull that only an expert would notice, all pointed toward the evolutionary direction this lineage would take. The Eocene also saw the flourishing of primates across much of the world, and not just at the margins. Primates were abundant and diverse, occupying ecological niches in the tropical forests that extended over much of the northern hemisphere. There were dozens of species, some similar to modern lemurs, others more similar to tarsiers, others representing evolutionary experiments that have no exact modern equivalent. Darwinius massillae, discovered in the Messel deposits in Germany, is one of the most complete primate fossils ever found. Its preservation is so extraordinary that we can see the outline of its fur, the content of its stomach, even the details of its soft tissues. Darwinius was a small primate, about the size of a cat, with a long tail and fingers adapted for grasping branches. It ate fruits and leaves, living in the tropical forests that covered Europe during the early Eocene. The Messel deposits are a paleontological treasure of incalculable value. 47 million years ago, this place was a volcanic lake in the middle of a tropical forest. Periodically, the lake released toxic gases that killed animals on its shores. Their bodies fell into the anoxic lake waters, where the absence of oxygen prevented decomposition. Millions of years later, these fossils reveal details of Eocene life that are impossible to obtain elsewhere. Insects, with their color patterns preserved. Bats, with their wing membranes intact. Birds with feathers still visible. And primates like Darwinius, frozen in time. Speaking of bats, these flying mammals also appeared during the Eocene, although their fossil record is frustratingly sparse because their fragile bones do not preserve well. Icaronicterus from the early Eocene of Wyoming is one of the oldest known bats and already shows all the adaptations for powered flight that define the group. Its fingers are elongated to support the flight membrane. Its bones are light and hollow. Its anatomy shows clear adaptations for echolocation, the sonar system that allows bats to navigate in darkness. The origin of bat flight is one of the great mysteries of mammalian evolution. Unlike the evolution of whales, where we have a sequence of fossils showing a gradual transition from land to sea, we have no fossils showing bats learning to fly. Icaronicterus and other early bats appear in the fossil record already fully formed, already capable of powered flight, already equipped with echolocation. This is probably because the transition happened quickly in evolutionary terms, in small animals that did not fossilize well, in forest environments where preservation conditions are rarely ideal. What we do know is that bats were extraordinarily successful. Today they represent approximately 20% of all mammal species. They are the most diverse mammals after rodents. They have colonized all continents except Antarctica, and it all began in the Eocene night skies. But not everything in the Eocene was warm and tropical. Toward the end of the period, something begins to change. Global temperatures, which had been high but stable for millions of years, begin to drop. At first, the change is gradual, almost imperceptible on the scale of individual lives or even generations. But over millions of years, the cooling accumulates. Tropical forests retreat toward the equator. The first ice begins to form in Antarctica. This cooling is related to fundamental tectonic changes that were reconfiguring the planet's geography. Antarctica, which had been connected to Australia and South America, forming the ancient supercontinent of Gondwana, finally separates from its neighbors. Australia drifts northward. South America remains connected to Antarctica only by a narrow land bridge that will eventually break. When Antarctica becomes isolated, the Antarctic Circumpolar Current forms. This is a flow of water that completely surrounds the southern continent. preventing warm waters from the north from reaching its coasts. The effect is devastating for Antarctic climate. Deprived of heat from lower latitudes, Antarctica begins to cool rapidly. Ice begins to accumulate, first on the highest mountains, then gradually extending toward the coasts. The growth of Antarctic glaciers has global consequences. Ice reflects more sunlight back to space than oceans or land, an effect known as albedo. More ice means more reflection, which means lower temperatures, which means more ice. It is a feedback cycle that accelerates global cooling. Additionally, the growth of glaciers locks up enormous amounts of water as terrestrial ice, causing global sea level to drop. Shallow continental shelves become exposed. Coastal geography changes. Marine ecosystems that depended on shallow, warm waters are disrupted. This transition marks the end of the Eocene and the beginning of a new epoch, the Oligocene. The event that separates these two epochs, known as the Grande Coupure, or simply the Eocene-Oligocene event, was one of the most dramatic faunal changes of the Cenozoic. If the Eocene was a tropical party, the Oligocene is the hangover. Temperatures drop dramatically, especially at high latitudes. What had been tropical forests in Europe and North America become temperate forests, and then savannas and prairies. Humid forests contract toward the equator and toward isolated refugia. Grasslands begin to expand for the first time in Earth's history, transforming entire landscapes. The Eocene-Oligocene event was devastating for many mammalian lineages. In Europe, the fauna changed so dramatically that paleontologists speak of the Grande Coupure, the Great Cut, a nearly total replacement of the continent's mammalian fauna. Primates virtually disappear from Europe and North America, taking refuge in the tropical forests of Africa and Asia that would persist through the cooling. The large Eocene herbivores, many of them adapted to diets of tender leaves in humid forests, go extinct or are replaced by new forms adapted to drier conditions. In North America, the change was equally dramatic. The titanotheres, Eocene giants that looked like rhinoceroses with branching horns over their noses, disappeared completely. The oreodonts, a diverse group of herbivorous mammals with no close modern analog, began to dominate the emerging prairies. But these oreodonts were different from their Eocene ancestors, smaller, more adapted to open environments, with teeth that could process tougher vegetation. But other groups thrive in this new, colder, drier world. The emerging grasslands favor a new type of herbivore, long-legged animals capable of running fast to escape predators in open terrain where there are no longer trees to climb. With teeth adapted for chewing abrasive grass full of silica that wears down enamel, horses begin their transformation from small, short-legged forest creatures to prairie runners. During the Oligocene, genera like Mesohippus and Miohippus show the beginning of this transition. They are larger than their Eocene ancestors, with 3 functional toes instead of 4, with slightly higher crowned teeth. Ruminants, the ancestors of deer, antelope, and cattle, diversify and expand. Their multi-chambered digestive system, which allows them to extract more nutrients from fibrous vegetation through bacterial fermentation, proves to be a crucial advantage in a world where grass replaces tender leaves. Ruminants can thrive on foods that other herbivores cannot digest efficiently. Rodents also diversify enormously during the Oligocene. Many modern rodent groups have their roots in this epoch. Beavers, squirrels, mice, and rats all begin their path toward the numerical dominance they maintain to this day. Rodents are perhaps the most successful mammals of the Cenozoic in terms of number of species and individuals. Their success is due to multiple factors: small size that allows them to exploit microhabitats, incisor teeth that grow continuously, allowing them to gnaw hard materials, high reproductive rate that allows them to recover quickly from population losses, and remarkable dietary flexibility. In Eurasia appears one of the most extraordinary mammals that has ever existed, Indricotherium, also known as Paraceratherium, or, under the older name, Balucotherium. Imagine a rhinoceros without a horn. Now imagine it 7 meters tall at the shoulder, with a long neck like a giraffe's, weighing up to 20 tons. Some scientists estimate that the largest individuals might have reached 25 tons. Indricotherium is the largest land mammal that has ever existed, surpassing even the largest elephants that would come later. Indricotherium roamed the plains of Central Asia during the Oligocene, feeding on treetops like a strange mammalian version of the extinct sauropods. Its long neck allowed it to reach vegetation at heights that no other mammal could touch. Its teeth, though already reduced compared to those of its more typical rhinoceros ancestors, could tear branches and leaves from trees up to 8 meters high. The existence of Indricotherium raises fascinating questions about the limits of body size in mammals. Why has no land mammal reached the size of the great sauropod dinosaurs, which could exceed 80 tons? Part of the answer has to do with thermoregulation. Mammals constantly generate internal heat through our metabolism. This heat must be dissipated to the environment to avoid overheating. But as an animal grows, its volume increases faster than its surface area. Volume, where heat is generated, grows as the cube of linear size. Surface area, where heat is dissipated, grows only as the square. A sufficiently large mammal would have difficulty dissipating the heat generated by its own metabolism. It would cook itself from the inside. Sauropod dinosaurs probably had metabolisms intermediate between cold-blooded modern reptiles and warm-blooded mammals, generating less internal heat and thus avoiding the overheating problem. Or perhaps they had special adaptations, such as extensive air sacs inside their bodies, that reduced their effective mass and improved heat dissipation. Mammals do not have these adaptations. Indricotherium therefore represents something close to the practical maximum limit for a land mammal. And it is fitting that it appeared during the Oligocene, in a world where open grasslands offered abundant plant resources, and where global cooling perhaps helped dissipate the excess body heat of these gigantic animals. Meanwhile, in the oceans, cetaceans continue their diversification. The Oligocene marks a crucial turning point in whale evolution. The mysticetes, baleen whales, appear during this epoch, developing their unique filtration system that allows them to feed on krill and small planktonic organisms. Instead of teeth, baleen whales have keratin plates that hang from their upper jaws, creating a filter that retains small animals while expelling water. This adaptation is revolutionary. It allows whales to feed on the most abundant animals in the ocean, zooplankton, and small fish that form massive schools. The ancestors of baleen whales, like Etiacetus from the late Oligocene, show a fascinating combination of features. They had both teeth and primitive baleen, documenting the transition between the predatory cetaceans of the Eocene and modern filter-feeding whales. The odontocetes, toothed whales, also diversified during the Oligocene. This group includes dolphins, porpoises, orcas, sperm whales, and beaked whales. Unlike their baleen cousins, odontocetes retain teeth and feed on individual prey, fish, squid, and, in the case of orcas, even other marine mammals. Odontocetes also perfect echolocation, the biological sonar system that allows them to locate prey and navigate in dark waters through pulses of sound. The cetacean dominance of the oceans, which continues to this day, becomes firmly established during the Oligocene. Whales have become the supreme predators and filter feeders of the seas, occupying ecological niches that had remained vacant since the extinction of Mesozoic marine reptiles. In South America, isolated from the rest of the world by oceans in all directions, evolution follows its own unique path. The South American ungulates, a diverse group of herbivores that were not related to any ungulates of the Northern Hemisphere, develop increasingly strange and varied forms. Pyrotherium, from the Oligocene, looks like an elephant. It has a short trunk, tusks that curve upward, and a massive body, but it is not related to elephants at all. It is a perfect example of convergent evolution, two completely independent lineages arriving at similar solutions for similar problems. True elephants evolved in Africa from ancestors like Moeritherium. Pyritherium evolved in South America from a completely different lineage. But both developed trunks, both developed tusks, both reached large sizes. The convergence is so remarkable that early paleontologists thought they must be related. Though Therium, which will appear somewhat later but whose roots go back to the Oligocene, looks like a horse. It has slender limbs ending in hooves, adapted for running on open prairies. Its teeth have high crowns for chewing grass, but it has no relationship to true horses which evolved in North America. It is another case of astonishing convergent evolution. But South America also has its own unique predators. The Sparacidonts, carnivorous marsupial mammals, occupy the niche of the large cats that dominate the northern continents. These predatory marsupials develop forms that mimic cats, dogs, hyenids. Some develop saber teeth, converging in form with the Machaerodont felids of the northern hemisphere that would appear millions of years later. Thylacosmilus, though it does not appear until the Miocene and Pliocene, represents the culmination of this evolution. It was a jaguar-sized marsupial with enormously elongated upper canines, similar to those of Smilodon but developed completely independently. Its saber teeth grew continuously throughout its life, and it had bony projections on the lower jaw that protected these fragile fangs when the mouth was closed. It is a perfect example of how evolution, faced with similar challenges, tends to find similar solutions even on continents separated by oceans. And then there are the terror birds. The forest wrasses are a family of flightless birds that evolve in South America during the Cenozoic, reaching their greatest diversity during the Oligocene and Miocene. Some reached 3 meters in height, with beaks as large as a horse's head. Their beaks, enormous and curved like battle axes, could crack skulls with ease. They were the supreme predators of their continent, occupying the ecological niche that in other places belonged to large carnivorous mammals. Imagine encountering a Forus racos on the Oligocene South American pampas. A bird 2.5 meters tall, with muscular legs capable of high-speed pursuit, with a beak that could pierce your skull with a single blow. It does not fly. It does not need to. Its wings are vestigial, barely useless stumps, but its legs are powerful, ending in claws that can grip and tear prey. The anatomy of terror birds reveals their predatory lifestyle in exquisite detail. Their skulls were pneumatized, filled with air spaces that reduced weight while maintaining strength, a design perfect for repeated striking. The attachment points for neck muscles show they could deliver devastating downward blows. Their leg bones were thick and strong, built for absorbing the shock of high-speed pursuit and sudden direction changes. Some species had elongated legs adapted for sustained running across open grasslands. Others were more heavily built, perhaps ambush predators that relied on short bursts of speed. The largest terror bird known, Kelenkin guillermois from Argentina, had a skull nearly 70 centimeters long, the largest skull of any known bird. Its beak alone measured over 45 centimeters. This was an apex predator by any measure, capable of killing prey as large as itself. Fossil evidence suggests Kelenkin hunted the diverse herbivores of Miocene South America, the native ungulates and large rodents that had no experience with such a predator. Paleontologists have debated exactly how terror birds hunted. One hypothesis suggests they used their massive beaks, like ice picks, striking prey repeatedly until killing them. Biomechanical studies support this idea, showing that the skull and neck were designed for powerful vertical strikes. The hook tip of the beak could penetrate flesh and bone, while the straight cutting edge behind it could slice through tissue. Another hypothesis suggests they grabbed small prey with their beaks and slammed them against the ground, as modern birds do with snails. A third hypothesis proposes they were primarily scavengers, using their powerful beaks to open carcasses that other predators could not exploit. Most likely, they were opportunists, like many modern predators. They hunted when they could, scavenged when convenient, and their dominance of the South American prairies lasted millions of years. Different species probably specialized in different strategies, just as modern eagles and vultures partition the predator-scavenger spectrum. The evolutionary success of terror birds raises fascinating questions about the relationship between birds and mammals as predators. Why did flightless birds dominate the carnivore niche in South America, while mammals dominated everywhere else? Part of the answer lies in timing. When the dinosaurs went extinct, the ancestors of terror birds were already present in South America, while carnivorous mammals were rare or absent. The terror birds filled the vacant predator niches before mammalian competitors could evolve or arrive. Once established, they were apparently able to maintain their dominance against the marsupial carnivores that evolved alongside them. The Sparassodonts, South America's native carnivorous marsupials, were certainly formidable in their own right, but they never achieved the same dominance as placental carnivores in other continents. Perhaps the presence of terror birds limited their ecological opportunities. Perhaps the peculiarities of marsupial reproduction, which produces tiny, undeveloped young that must crawl to the pouch, made it harder for them to compete with large avian predators. Whatever the reason, the coexistence of terror, birds, and sparassodonts created an ecosystem unlike any other on Earth, a world where birds ruled from above and marsupials lurked below. It is not until the arrival of placental carnivores from the north, after the closing of the Isthmus of Panama, that terror birds would begin their decline. Even then, some genera like Titanus managed to invade North America and survive until barely 2 million years ago. Titanus was found as far north as Texas and Florida, proof that terror birds could compete with mammalian predators when given the chance. But ultimately, the flood of northern species was too much. The saber-toothed cats, the dire wolves, the bears and jaguars that crossed the isthmus were superior predators, refined by millions of years of competition in the crucible of the northern hemisphere. Against such competition, the terror birds finally fell silent. The Oligocene lasts approximately 11 million years, from 34 to 23 million years ago. When it ends, the world is significantly colder than at the end of the Eocene. Antarctica is covered with permanent ice, though the ice cap is smaller than today's. Grasslands have replaced forests across large expanses of the continents. The mammals that survive this transition are adapted to a harder, more competitive world, where grass has replaced leaves as the main food of herbivores. Meanwhile, in the world's oceans, another predator is emerging. One that will capture the human imagination millions of years later and represents perhaps the greatest hunter the seas have ever known since the extinction of the mosasaurs. Ototus megalodon, commonly known simply as megalodon, appears in the fossil record during the early Miocene, about 20 million years ago. If Basilosaurus was impressive, Megalodon was apocalyptic. The most conservative estimates suggest it reached 15 meters in length. The most generous propose up to 20 meters. It was, without a doubt, the largest shark that ever existed, possibly the largest predatory fish of all time. To understand Megalodon's size, consider this. A modern great white shark, the most feared marine predator in today's oceans, rarely exceeds 6 meters and 2,000 kilograms. Megalodon was 3 times longer and could have weighed 50 tons or more. Its jaws, reconstructed from the fossilized teeth found all over the world, measured more than 3 meters wide. It could have swallowed a compact car without effort. Megalodon teeth are the most common shark fossils because, like all sharks, it continuously renewed its teeth throughout its life. A single individual could have produced thousands of teeth over decades of existence. These teeth, some up to 18 centimeters long, are triangular, serrated, perfectly designed to cut through flesh and bone. Collectors have sought them for centuries, and for a long time they were believed to be petrified tongues of dragons or serpents. Megalodon was a hunter specialized in large prey. Whale fossils from the Miocene and Pliocene frequently show bite marks consistent with this giant's teeth. Some fossilized whales have vertebrae and ribs with deep, parallel cuts, evidence of attacks from below, possibly aimed at the fins and tail to incapacitate the prey before the final blow. Megalodon did not attack to kill instantly. It attacked to mutilate, to bleed, to weaken, and then it waited. Megalodon's dominance lasted approximately 15 million years, from the early Miocene to the late Pliocene. Throughout all this time, it was the supreme ocean predator, without rival, without serious competitor. Even the primitive orcas that were beginning to evolve during this period were no threat to a predator of such size and power. But eventually, Megalodon went extinct. The exact causes are still debated. The global cooling of the late Pliocene probably reduced the availability of its preferred prey. Baleen whales began migrating to polar waters where Megalodon, adapted to warmer seas, probably could not follow them efficiently. Competition with orcas, which organized in groups and could hunt cooperatively, may have been a factor. The closing of the Isthmus of Panama altered ocean currents and marine productivity patterns. Whatever the cause, approximately 3,600,000 years ago, Megalodon vanished forever. The oceans would never again see a predator of its scale. Today, the great white shark, a distant and diminutive relative by comparison, reigns where the greatest shark in history once hunted. And then comes the Miocene. The Miocene is perhaps the period of the Cenozoic that most resembles the world we know. It spans from 23 to 5 million years ago, 18 million years of evolutionary history that shape modern fauna in fundamental ways. If you could travel to the Middle Miocene, you would find a strange but recognizable world. The animals would have familiar shapes, though the species would be different. The landscapes would be similar to today's, with prairies, forests, deserts, mountains. It would be a world where you could orient yourself, unlike the alien greenhouse of the Eocene. During the early Miocene, temperatures partially recover from the cold of the Oligocene. We do not return to Eocene heat, but the world becomes warmer and wetter than it had been during the previous millions of years. This warmer period is known as the Miocene climatic optimum, and it lasts approximately from 17 to 14 million years ago. Forests expand again during this optimum, though they never recover their Eocene extent. Tropical rainforests extend to higher latitudes than today. Primates, which had disappeared from Europe during the Oligocene, return. The great apes, ancestors of gorillas, chimpanzees, orangutans, and humans, diversify in the forests of Africa, Europe, and Asia. The Miocene climatic optimum was a period of extraordinary evolutionary experimentation for primates. In the forests of Europe lived apes of multiple species, each adapted to slightly different niches. Pliopithecus, which some consider closer to modern gibbons than to great apes, swung among the branches of Central European forests. Dryopithecus was larger, more chimpanzee-like, capable of walking on branches using its arms for balance. Oreopithecus, from the islands that then existed where Italy is today, developed such peculiar adaptations that some paleontologists have suggested it could walk upright millions of years before our direct ancestors did. Though this hypothesis is controversial, what we do know is that Oreopithecus had an unusual pelvis and spine, different from any other known ape. In Africa, the heart of hominid evolution, diversity was equally impressive. These were not yet our direct ancestors, but they were our relatives, part of the evolutionary bush from which humanity would eventually emerge. Kenyapithecus, Equatorius, Nacolopithecus. The names are technical, but each represents a real species, a lineage that lived and died in African forests 15 million years ago. Each had its own way of living, its own ecological niche. its own story we will never fully know. Asia was no less diverse. Civipithecus, whose fossils have been found in India and Pakistan, was probably the ancestor of modern orangutans. Lufangpithecus lived in China. Gigantopithecus, which would appear later and survive until relatively recently, would reach enormous sizes, perhaps the largest primates that ever existed, gorilla-sized but possibly even heavier. The Miocene climatic optimum also witnessed fundamental changes in grassland ecosystems. It was not just horses adapting to this new world of grass. Grasslands created opportunities for an entire community of interconnected animals. Insects changed to exploit the new resource. Grasshoppers and locusts, which feed on grass, diversified enormously. Termites, which can digest cellulose with the help of symbiotic microorganisms, built increasingly elaborate mounds. Seed harvesting ants thrived in prairies where grass seeds were abundant. Small mammals also adapted. Field mice, voles, burrowing gophers all found niches in the emerging prairies. Some dug elaborate tunnel systems, protected from predators and from climatic extremes. Others collected seeds and stored them for winter, behaviors we still see in their modern descendants. Predators followed their prey. Prairie snakes, like the ancestors of modern rattlesnakes, evolved more potent venoms and heat detection systems to hunt rodents in tall grass. Prairie hawks and eagles developed sharp vision and hovering techniques to locate prey in low vegetation. Ancestral wolves perfected pack hunting, surrounding prey that in open spaces could not hide. The food chain of the Miocene prairies was as complex and sophisticated as any modern ecosystem, and at the center of it all was grass, that apparently simple plant that had transformed the world. But grasslands continued to dominate middle latitudes, and it is in these Miocene grasslands where some of the most fascinating chapters of mammalian evolution are written. It is in the Miocene grasslands where horses complete their transformation. The genus Merychippus, which appears about 17 million years ago, shows clear adaptations for life in open spaces. Its teeth have higher crowns, covered with cement in addition to enamel, better adapted for chewing abrasive grass over decades of life. Grass contains phytoliths, small silica crystals that wear down teeth with every bite. Herbivores that cannot compensate for this die young before reproducing enough. Horses evolved high-crowned teeth in response to this selective pressure. The evolution of high-crowned teeth in horses is one of the best documented examples of adaptive evolution in the fossil record. We can trace the gradual increase in tooth crown height across millions of years, correlating precisely with the spread of grasslands. Earlier horses, like Eohippus and Mesohippus, had low-crowned teeth suitable for browsing on soft leaves. As grasslands expanded, horse teeth grew taller, generation by generation, tracking the changing availability of food. It is evolution captured in stone, undeniable and measurable. The change in teeth was accompanied by changes throughout the horse's body. The digestive system adapted to extract nutrients from tough, fibrous grass, a much more difficult food source than tender forest leaves. The hindgut fermentation system of modern horses, with its enormous cecum filled with bacteria that break down cellulose, evolved during this period. Horses became walking fermentation vats, processing vast quantities of low-quality food to extract enough energy to fuel their active lifestyles. Merychippus's legs are longer and thinner than those of its ancestors, optimized for sustained running. Though it still has 3 toes, the central one is significantly larger than the lateral ones, bearing most of the weight. The lateral toes barely touch the ground when the animal runs. It is the beginning of the process that will eventually produce the single hoof of modern horses. The reduction from multiple toes to a single hoof represents one of the most extreme skeletal modifications in mammalian evolution. Each step in the sequence is preserved in the fossil record. From the 4-toed Eohippus through the three-toed Mesohippus and Merychippus, to the single-toed Pleohippus, and finally Equus, we can watch the side toes shrinking, the central toe enlarging, the ankle bones fusing into the powerful spring mechanism that allows modern horses to run at speeds exceeding 60 kilometers per hour. It is as if evolution were conducting an engineering experiment, optimizing a running machine over tens of millions of years. But the evolution of horses was not a simple, linear progression from small forest browsers to large prairie runners. The family tree of horses is actually a complex bush, with many branches that evolved in different directions and eventually went extinct. At various times during the Cenozoic, there were horses that were growing smaller rather than larger, horses that were becoming more specialized for browsing rather than grazing, horses that were experimenting with different numbers of toes and different body plans. Evolution is not a ladder but a branching tree, and horses explored many branches before settling on the form we know today. Eventually, in the Pliocene, Equus will appear, the genus that includes all modern horses, donkeys, and zebras. And from North America, where they evolved, horses will disperse to all continents except Australia and Antarctica. It is ironic that horses went extinct in their continent of origin about 10,000 years ago, only to be reintroduced by Spanish colonizers millions of years later. The wild mustangs of North America are, in a sense, descendants of exiles returning home. But horses are not the only runners of the Miocene grasslands. Antelopes, deer, and other ruminants diversify explosively. Bovids, the family that includes antelopes, goats, sheep, and cattle, appear during the Miocene and soon dominate Old World grasslands. Cervids, the deer family, diversify in Eurasia and North America. Antilocaprids, which today are represented only by the pronghorn of North America, were once diverse and abundant. The ancestors of camelids, surprisingly, evolve in North America during the Miocene. This contradicts most people's intuition, which associates camels with the deserts of Africa and Asia, but the first camelids were North American and only later dispersed to other continents. Some crossed to Asia via the Bering Land Bridge and eventually gave rise to the camels and dromedaries of the Old World. Others crossed south when the Isthmus of Panama closed and gave rise to the llamas, alpacas, guanacos, and vicuñas of South America. Camelids went extinct in their continent of origin, along with most of the North American megafauna, leaving their descendants only in the Old World and the Andes. Rhinoceroses, which we now associate with Africa and Asia, are abundant in North America during the Miocene. Teleoceras, a short-legged rhinoceros that was probably semi-aquatic like a hippopotamus, is one of the most common mammals in Miocene fossil sites of the Great Plains. There were so many individuals that paleontologists have found bone beds with dozens of skeletons, probably groups that died together during droughts or floods. Among predators, modern dogs reached their recognizable form during the Miocene. The ancestors of wolves, coyotes, and foxes hunt in the North American prairies. Some, like the bear dogs of the genus Amphicyon, reach enormous sizes, rivaling modern bears. Others, like the ancestors of hunting dogs, develop the long legs and endurance that characterize running canids. And felids, which had been relatively small during much of the Cenozoic, begin to produce larger and more specialized forms. It is during the Miocene that the first true saber-toothed cats appear, the Machaerodonts. These are not the South American Sparacidonts, which are marsupials, nor Thylacosmolus, which is also a marsupial. The true Machaerodonts are placental felids, close relatives of lions, tigers, and domestic cats, which evolve enormously elongated upper canines in the northern hemisphere. Saber teeth evolved independently multiple times during the Cenozoic, in Machaerodonts of the northern hemisphere, in South American Sparacidonts, in marsupial Thylacosmolids also of South America, and even in some lesser-known mammals. This repeated convergence suggests that saber teeth are a particularly effective evolutionary solution for certain types of predation, probably for killing large, thick-skinned prey by cutting blood vessels and tracheas with a stabbing motion. But perhaps the most significant development of the Miocene, at least from our human perspective, happens in Africa. In the forests of Miocene Africa live diverse primates. Among them is a particular family, the hominids, the group that includes great apes and humans. The ancestors of gorillas, chimpanzees, orangutans, and also human ancestors are diversifying in this continent and in parts of Eurasia. Fossils like proconsul from about 18 million years ago in Kenya show us apes that lived in trees but occasionally came down to the ground. Proconsul lacked a tail like all modern great apes and had a brain larger than monkeys. It probably moved through branches similarly to modern chimpanzees, though it did not have all the specializations that allow chimps to hang from their arms so easily. During the Middle Miocene, 15 to 10 million years ago, great apes were extraordinarily diverse. There were apes in Europe. Dryopithecus roamed the forests of Spain and France. There were apes in Asia. Civipithecus, probably ancestor of modern orangutans, lived in what is now Pakistan and India. European and Asian apes would eventually go extinct when forests contracted at the end of the Miocene, but they left descendants in the tropical rainforests of Southeast Asia. In Africa, the lineage that would eventually produce humans continued its evolution. Fossils like Sahelanthropus tishadensis from about 6 or 7 million years ago in Chad might represent some of the first steps toward the human line. Sahelanthropus had a skull with intriguing features, a relatively flat face, small canines, and the position of the foramen magnum, where the spine connects to the skull, suggested a more upright posture than chimpanzees. Orurin tuganensis from Kenya about 6 million years ago shows leg bones that some scientists interpret as evidence of bipedalism. Ardipithecus from about 5 to 4 million years ago in Ethiopia is perhaps the best documented of these early hominids, with a partial skeleton nicknamed Ardi that shows us a creature combining features of arboreal apes with adaptations for walking on 2 legs. But beware of oversimplifying this story. Human evolution was not a straight line from apes to us. It was a tangled bush of species, evolutionary experiments, lineages that flourished and went extinct without leaving descendants. During the late Miocene and following periods, multiple hominid species coexisted in Africa. Most disappeared. Only one twig of that bush survived to the present to wonder where it came from. And that survival was in no way guaranteed. In every generation, in every climate crisis, in every encounter with predators or competitors, our ancestors could have failed. They could have been the lineage that went extinct while another thrived. The fact that you are reading this is the result of an unbroken chain of survival that extends millions of years into the past. Meanwhile, tectonic events are setting the stage for massive transformations of world fauna. About 15 million years ago, Africa, which had been separated from Eurasia by a sea known as Tethys, finally connects to the northern continent through Arabia. Animals can cross in both directions, and they do so in waves that transform the ecosystems of both continents. African proboscideans, the ancestors of elephants, invade Eurasia and eventually North America. Dinotherium, with its downward curving tusks, roams European forests. Gomphotherium and its relatives disperse throughout the northern hemisphere. Eventually, mastodons would reach North America through the Bering Land Bridge, where they would thrive until the arrival of humans. Antelopes and bovids of Eurasian origin enter Africa, beginning the diversification that would produce the extraordinary variety of modern African antelopes. Felids, which had evolved mainly in Eurasia, dispersed toward Africa where they would find their greatest diversity. The ancestors of modern lions, leopards, and cheetahs arrive in Africa from the north. This faunal interchange transforms the ecosystems of both continents. The African savannas, with their iconic fauna of large mammals, are largely the result of this mixture of African and Eurasian lineages, shaped by the climatic changes of the late Miocene that expanded grasslands at the expense of forests. And there is another connection approaching, one that will have even more dramatic consequences for the fauna of two continents that had been separated for tens of millions of years. During the late Miocene, North America and South America begin to approach each other. The movement of tectonic plates is pushing South America northward, while volcanic activity creates islands in what will eventually become the Isthmus of Panama. The isthmus does not yet exist as a continuous land bridge, but the volcanic islands between the two continents allow a limited exchange. Some animals, probably good swimmers, or capable of traveling on floating vegetation, cross in both directions. The first to cross seem to have been small mammals. South American rodents, the caviomorphs that include capybaras, guinea pigs, and chinchillas, probably arrived in South America from Africa, crossing the Atlantic on vegetation rafts about 40 million years ago. But during the Miocene, some mammals begin to cross the strait between the Americas. Procyonids, the raccoon family, appear to have reached South America from the north before the isthmus closed completely. Some ground sloths may have crossed north by the same route, but the real event, the Great American Biotic Interchange, will have to wait until the Pliocene. The Miocene ends about 5 million years ago, giving way to the Pliocene. This period, relatively short at only about 2.5 million years, is the immediate prelude to the world we know. Temperatures continue to drop gradually, though with fluctuations. Antarctic ice caps expand, reaching a size close to today's. Ice begins to form in the Arctic for the first time in many millions of years. Pliocene cooling has dramatic consequences for terrestrial ecosystems. In Africa, tropical rainforests contract toward the center of the continent while savannas expand. This landscape change puts pressure on forest hominids. Those that can adapt to the more open savanna environments have new opportunities. Those that depend on the shrinking forests face increasing competition for limited resources. And then, approximately 3 million years ago, the Isthmus of Panama closes. The Great American Biotic Interchange is one of the most dramatic and best documented events in recent Earth life history. For tens of millions of years, North America and South America had been separated, developing completely different faunas. South America had its carnivorous marsupials, its native ungulates, its terror birds, its giant ground sloths, its car-sized armadillos. North America had felids, canids, horses, camelids, proboscideans. When the isthmus closed, it was like opening the doors between two completely different zoos. The results were devastating for South American fauna. Northern predators, especially saber-toothed cats and large canids, proved more efficient than South American carnivorous marsupials. Terror birds, which had been supreme predators for millions of years, could not compete with northern mammals. Native South American ungulates, those strange animals that looked like horses and elephants but were not, were gradually replaced by true horses and proboscideans from the north. In a few million years, most of South America's native mammalian fauna went extinct or was reduced to relict populations. The exceptions were notable. Sloths, armadillos, and anteaters survived and thrived. Some even successfully invaded North America. Giant ground sloths dispersed as far as Alaska. Armadillos reached what is now Texas. The porcupine, of South American origin, colonized much of North America. But the general trend was clear. North American fauna dominated. It is a sobering reminder that evolution has no favorites. The ancient and diverse South American fauna, product of millions of years of isolated evolution, was largely replaced in a geological blink when barriers fell. The Pliocene also saw crucial developments in human evolution. In Africa, hominids are actively diversifying. Australopithecus, our famous bipedal ancestor, appears about 4 million years ago. Lucy, the most famous skeleton of Australopithecus afarensis, lived about 3,200,000 years ago in what is now Ethiopia. The story of Lucy's discovery is itself an extraordinary tale. On November 24th, 1974, paleoanthropologist Donald Johanson and his student Tom Gray were exploring the desert landscape of Hadar in the Ethiopian Afar Depression. The terrain was inhospitable, hot, strewn with fossils that time had eroded from ancient sediments. And there, poking out of the ground, Johansen saw a bone fragment he immediately recognized as a hominid elbow. What followed was one of the most important finds in the history of paleoanthropology. Over the following weeks, the team recovered hundreds of bone fragments that, once assembled, revealed approximately 40% of a female hominid skeleton. It was extraordinarily complete for a fossil of that age, and the bones told a revolutionary story. Lucy stood barely 1 meter tall and weighed perhaps 27 kilograms, the size of a modern 6-year-old child. Her brain was small, approximately the size of a chimpanzee's. But her pelvis and legs told a different story. The shape of her hip, the angle of her femur, the structure of her knees all indicated she walked upright. Lucy was bipedal. 3,200,000 years ago, long before the human brain began its dramatic expansion, our ancestors were already walking on 2 legs. The name Lucy comes from the Beatles song Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, which was playing at the camp the night of the discovery while the team celebrated. In Amharic, Ethiopia's language, they called her Dinkinesh, meaning, "You are wonderful." And wonderful she was, because Lucy changed forever our understanding of human evolution. Before Lucy, many scientists believed bipedalism had evolved along with large brains, that walking upright and intelligence had arisen together as an evolutionary package. Lucy proved they were wrong. Bipedalism came first, millions of years before human brains began to expand. Our ancestors walked upright, not because they were intelligent, but for other reasons. Perhaps to free their hands, perhaps to see over tall savanna grass, perhaps to better regulate body temperature under the African sun, perhaps for reasons we will never fully understand. But Lucy was not human. Her arms were proportionally longer than ours, with curved fingers suggesting she still spent time in trees. Her brain was small, without capacity for language or the abstract thought that defines us. She probably lived in small groups, ate fruits, leaves, roots, and insects, and faced predators that saw her as prey rather than competitor. The lions, hyenas, and leopards of Pliocene Africa did not distinguish between intelligent and non-intelligent prey. Lucy and her relatives were, to them, simply potential food. Lucy's family, the Australopithecines, was remarkably diverse. Besides Australopithecus afarensis, there were other species adapted to different niches. Australopithecus africanus from South Africa had a slightly larger brain. Australopithecus sediba, recently discovered also in South Africa, shows a fascinating mix of primitive and derived features. The paranthropines, which some classify as a separate genus, developed enormous jaws and teeth, adapted for processing hard, fibrous vegetation. And somewhere in this diversity of bipedal hominids, approximately 2.5 million years ago, something new emerged. A hominid with a slightly larger brain, with hands capable of making stone tools with sharp edges, with a diet that probably included more meat than its ancestors. Scientists call it Homo, the genus to which we belong. And from that genus, through millions of years of evolution, climate change, and astonishing contingency, we would eventually emerge. Australopithecines walked upright, though they probably still spent time in trees. Their brains were small, not much larger than a chimpanzee's. They did not make stone tools, at least not that we know of, but they were taking the first steps, literally, toward humanity. And the world around them was changing rapidly. The climate was becoming colder, drier. African rainforests were contracting. Savannas were expanding. Hominids that could thrive in these new open environments would have an evolutionary advantage. those that depended on the shrinking forests would face hard times. It is in this context of accelerated climate change that we end the Pliocene and enter the Pleistocene, the epoch of the ice ages. Approximately 2,600,000 years ago, the world crosses a climatic threshold. The oscillations between cold and warm periods, which had existed on a smaller scale throughout the Cenozoic, intensify dramatically. The glaciations begin. The Pleistocene is the epoch of ice. For the next 2.5 million years, enormous ice sheets advance and retreat over the northern continents in cycles of approximately 100,000 years. At glacial maxima, ice covers Canada, the northern United States, most of northern Europe, and large expanses of Siberia. Sea level drops more than 100 meters because an immense amount of water is trapped as terrestrial ice. Land bridges emerge between normally separated continents. These glacial cycles are not random. They are controlled by predictable variations in Earth's orbit and the tilt of its rotation axis, known as Milankovitch cycles, in honor of the Serbian scientist who described them mathematically. Earth's orbit is not perfectly circular. It varies between more elliptical and more circular in cycles of approximately 100,000 years. The axis tilt oscillates between 21 and 24 degrees in cycles of 40,000 years, and the direction the axis points precesses, like a wobbling top, in cycles of 23,000 years. These variations change the amount of sunlight that reaches different latitudes in different seasons. When orbital geometry reduces the amount of heat reaching high northern latitudes during summer, previous winters leave snow that does not completely melt. Year after year, this snow accumulates, compacts, becomes ice. Glaciers grow. The white surface reflects more sunlight, cooling the climate further in a feedback loop. An ice age has begun. Eventually, orbital geometry changes again. Northern summers become warmer. Ice begins to melt. Sea level rises. Glaciers retreat toward the highest mountains. An interglacial period has arrived. And so on, for millions of years, in a cosmic rhythm that early humans never understood but their descendants would eventually decipher. We currently live in an interglacial period, the Holocene, which began about 11,700 years ago. Without human interference, Milankovitch cycles would probably lead us toward another glaciation within some tens of thousands of years. But anthropogenic climate change has altered this dynamic in ways we do not yet fully understand. And in this world of climatic extremes, some of the most extraordinary creatures of the Cenozoic reach their apex. The Pleistocene world was radically different from ours. The geography itself was transformed. With so much water locked in ice, coastlines extended far beyond their present positions. The North Sea was dry land, a vast plain connecting Britain to continental Europe where mammoths and rhinoceroses grazed. The English Channel did not exist. Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania were joined into a single landmass called Sahul. Southeast Asian islands merged with the mainland, forming Sundaland, a peninsula larger than India. Alaska and Siberia were connected by Beringia, a 1,000-kilometer-wide land bridge that served as a highway for animal and human migrations between continents. The vegetation of the Ice Age world was equally strange. Much of what is now temperate forest was either buried under ice or transformed into cold grassland. The Mammoth Steppe, also called the steppe tundra, was the dominant ecosystem across the northern hemisphere, stretching from Spain to Canada in an almost continuous band. It was unlike any ecosystem that exists today. The closest modern equivalent might be the dry grasslands of Central Asia, but even these lack the productivity and diversity of the Pleistocene original. What made the Mammoth Steppe so productive was a combination of factors. The cold, dry climate prevented the formation of bogs and wetlands that would otherwise have locked up nutrients. The soil remained frozen most of the year, a condition called permafrost, which preserved organic matter and kept nutrients available near the surface. And most importantly, the megafauna themselves maintain the ecosystem. Mammoths knocked down trees and scraped away snow, keeping the land open for grass. Their dung fertilized the soil. Their trampling compacted the ground, preventing the formation of insulating moss layers that would have caused the permafrost to thaw. Without the megafauna, the mammoth steppe could not exist. And when the megafauna disappeared, the ecosystem they had maintained disappeared with them, replaced by the boggy tundra and boreal forest we see today. This is a crucial insight that scientists have only recently come to understand. Ecosystems are not just the sum of their parts. The animals that live in them actively shape and maintain them. Remove the keystone species and the entire system can collapse into something completely different. The disappearance of the Pleistocene megafauna was not just a loss of individual species, it was the destruction of entire ecosystems that had existed for hundreds of thousands of years. Imagine the prairies of North America about 20,000 years ago, during the last glacial maximum. South of the enormous ice sheets covering Canada stretches a landscape scientists call the Mammoth Steppe. It is a cold, dry prairie, immensely productive, supporting incredible megafauna. Woolly mammoths, with their curved tusks and thick fur, wander in herds that can contain hundreds of individuals. They are smaller than mammoths of earlier epochs, adapted to extreme cold, with small ears to conserve heat and a thick layer of fat under the skin. They dig in the snow with their tusks to find the dry grass that sustains them during long winters. Alongside them graze bison, ancestors of modern American buffalo, but significantly larger. Males can weigh more than a ton. Their horns, extending horizontally more than a meter in each direction, are formidable weapons against the predators that stalk them. And there are many predators. Smilodon, the famous saber-toothed tiger, though technically not a tiger at all, stalks the steppe herbivores. Its upper canines, up to 28 centimeters long, are the most specialized weapons any felid has ever developed. But those teeth are not for biting and holding like modern cats do. They are too fragile, too prone to breaking. Smilodon used its fangs as daggers, stabbing them into the throat or belly of prey already immobilized by its powerful forelimbs. The dire wolf, Canis dirus, hunts in packs. It is heavier and more robust than modern wolves, with stronger jaws capable of crushing bones. Thousands of specimens have been found in the La Brea tar pits in California, trapped when trying to feed on other creatures already stuck. It is testimony to how abundant these predators were and how risky easy carrion could be. The American lion, Panthera atrox, is the largest cat that ever existed, even larger than modern African lions. It hunts alone or in small groups, capable of taking down prey the size of the largest bison. And it is not just carnivores that impress. Among herbivores, there are giants that rival anything that walked on Earth during the Cenozoic. Megatherium, the giant ground sloth, reaches 6 meters in height when it stands on its hind legs. It weighs more than 4 tons. Its claws, as long as machetes, allow it to tear entire branches from trees. Unlike its modern arboreal cousins, Megatherium is a ground dweller, too massive to climb. It moves slowly through prairies and forests, feeding on vegetation at heights no other herbivore can reach. Glyptodon, the armadillo relative, is the size of a Volkswagen Beetle. Its shell, made of fused bony plates, is armor so resistant that even Smilodon's saber teeth probably had difficulty penetrating it. Its tail ends in a spiny, bony mass that functions like a mace, capable of breaking the legs of any predator foolhardy enough to attack. In South America, Macrauchenia still runs across the pampas. This strange ungulate, one of the last representatives of native South American fauna, has a body that looks like a camel's, legs that look like a horse's, and a small flexible trunk like a tapir's. It is not related to any of these animals. It is unique, the last of its lineage, and will soon disappear forever. But perhaps the most formidable predator of the Pleistocene had neither saber fangs nor giant claws. Homo erectus appears in the African fossil record nearly 2 million years ago. This was not simply another hominid. This was something new, something that would change the trajectory of life on Earth. Homo erectus had a brain significantly larger than any Australopithecine, averaging about 900 cubic centimeters compared to the 4 to 500 of its ancestors. Its body was fully adapted for efficient bipedal locomotion, with long legs, a narrow pelvis, and a barrel-shaped chest that allowed for the endurance running that would become humanity's signature hunting strategy. The tools of Homo erectus represent a quantum leap in technology. While earlier hominids had made simple choppers by knocking a few flakes off a rock, Homo erectus invented the Acheulean hand axe, a symmetrical, teardrop-shaped tool that required planning, skill, and an understanding of how stone fractures. These hand axes appear in the fossil record about 1.7 million years ago, and they remain essentially unchanged for over 1 million years, the longest-lasting tool design in human history. Their persistence suggests either an extremely conservative culture or a design so perfect for its purposes that improvement was unnecessary. Homo erectus was also almost certainly the first hominid to master fire. The evidence is debated, with some sites showing possible fire use as early as 1.5 million years ago, but the importance of fire cannot be overstated. Fire meant warmth in cold climates, allowing expansion into temperate regions. Fire meant safety, keeping predators at bay during the vulnerable hours of night. Fire meant cooking, which softened tough plant materials and meat, reducing the energy needed for digestion and perhaps freeing metabolic resources for brain growth. Fire meant social gathering, a focal point around which groups could share food, tell stories, plan the next day's hunt. Fire, more than any tool or weapon, made humans who we are. With fire and tools and their remarkable brains, Homo erectus achieved something no hominid had done before. They left Africa. By 1.8 million years ago, Homo erectus populations had reached Georgia in the Caucasus. By 1 million years ago, they were in China and Indonesia. They occupied a range spanning from Spain to Java, from northern China to southern Africa. For over 1 million years, Homo erectus was the dominant hominid on 3 continents. Different populations of Homo erectus in different regions evolved in slightly different directions, adapting to local conditions while remaining recognizably the same species. Java man, discovered in Indonesia in 1891, was one of the first Homo erectus fossils ever found. Peking man, from caves near Beijing, provided evidence of systematic fire use and possible cannibalism. The Turkana boy, discovered in Kenya in 1984, is one of the most complete early human skeletons ever found, revealing a youth who would have grown to nearly 6 feet tall with a body essentially modern in proportions. Homo erectus was successful in ways no hominid had been before, but eventually their descendants would surpass them. In Africa, populations of late Homo erectus or closely related species began to develop larger brains, more sophisticated tools, more complex behaviors. The transition is gradual and messy in the fossil record, with species like Homo heidelbergensis representing intermediate forms between erectus and later humans. But the direction of change is clear, toward us. But it is a descendant of Homo erectus who will really change everything. Homo sapiens, our species, evolves in Africa about 300,000 years ago. The oldest known fossils that can be assigned to our species come from Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, dated to approximately 315,000 years ago. These early Homo sapiens had faces that looked essentially modern, but their brain cases were still somewhat elongated, not yet showing the globular shape that characterizes living humans. Over the next 100,000 years, the full suite of modern human anatomy would gradually emerge. But anatomy is only part of the story. What really distinguishes Homo sapiens from all other hominids is behavior. starting around 100,000 years ago and accelerating dramatically after 70,000 years ago. We see an explosion of symbolic behavior in the archaeological record. Shell beads for personal adornment, ochre pigments used for body decoration or cave painting, bone tools carved with intricate designs, burial of the dead with grave goods. The first musical instruments, simple flutes made from bird bones or mammoth ivory. This behavioral revolution, sometimes called the Upper Paleolithic Revolution or the Great Leap Forward, transformed our ancestors from a modestly successful African ape into a species capable of conquering the world. The exact cause is debated. Some scientists argue for a genetic change that enhanced language capacity. Others point to cultural innovations that allowed the accumulation and transmission of knowledge across generations. Others suggest that population growth reached a threshold where innovations could spread and build on each other rather than being lost. Whatever the cause, the result is clear. By 50,000 years ago, humans were doing things no other species had ever done. For most of our history, we are a relatively rare species, confined to Africa and perhaps parts of the Middle East. But about 70,000 years ago, something changes. Modern humans begin to expand out of Africa in waves that will eventually reach all habitable continents. The timing is intriguing. About 74,000 years ago, the supervolcano at Toba in Indonesia erupted in one of the largest volcanic events of the Cenozoic. Some scientists have argued that this eruption caused a volcanic winter that reduced human populations to perhaps only a few thousand individuals, a genetic bottleneck that nearly drove us to extinction. The evidence for this bottleneck is debated, but it is clear that human genetic diversity is remarkably low compared to other great apes, suggesting we passed through some kind of population crash in our recent past. Whether driven by the aftermath of Toba, by climate change, by population pressure, or simply by the wanderlust that seems to characterize our species, humans began to move. First to the Middle East and Arabia, then along the coasts of South Asia to Australia, then into the interior of Asia and eventually Europe, then across the Bering Land Bridge to the Americas. By 15,000 years ago, humans had reached every habitable continent. By 10,000 years ago, we had colonized most of the Pacific Islands. We had done in 100,000 years what no other large mammal had ever done. We had spread across the entire globe. And wherever we arrive, things begin to change. But before talking about what modern humans did to the world, we must talk about what the world was. The Pleistocene was not just the era of mammoths and saber-toothed tigers. It was an epoch of astonishing animal diversity on all continents, an era where each region had its unique cast of giants. Eurasia, that vast continent stretching from Portugal to the Bering Strait, harbored megafauna as impressive as anywhere else. The woolly rhinoceros, Coelodonta antiquitatis, roamed the cold steppes with its thick fur and two formidable horns. It was smaller than modern African rhinoceroses, an adaptation to cold that reduced heat loss. Its front horn could reach a meter in length, and it probably used it to push aside snow and reach frozen vegetation beneath. Some frozen specimens in Siberian permafrost preserve even the contents of their stomachs, revealing a diet of cold-resistant grasses and shrubs. Alongside the woolly rhinoceros walked the steppe bison, Bison priscus, ancestor of modern European and American bison. It was significantly larger than any of its descendants, with horns that could extend more than a meter in each direction. Steppe bison were a favorite prey of Paleolithic humans, as demonstrated by the countless cave paintings depicting them in the caves of France and Spain. The Megaloceros, Megaloceros giganteus, is perhaps the most spectacular deer that ever existed. Males bore antlers that could measure more than 3.5 meters from tip to tip and weigh more than 40 kilograms. Each year, these giant deer had to regenerate these enormous bony structures, an enormous energy expenditure requiring mineral-rich pastures. The antlers were not just for combat between males, though they were undoubtedly used for that. They were also signals of the male's genetic quality, indicators of his ability to find food and survive. Females chose males with the most impressive antlers, a selective pressure that led to increasingly extreme proportions until the animal bordered on the limits of the biomechanically viable. The cave lion, Panthera spelaea, was the largest cat that ever inhabited Europe. Larger than modern African lions, it hunted the same steppes as mammoths and woolly rhinos. The cave paintings of Chauvet in France represent it with astonishing precision. A lion without a mane, or with a very reduced mane, adapted to Pleistocene cold. It probably hunted in groups, like its modern relatives, coordinating attacks against prey that would individually be too dangerous. The cave hyena, Crocuta spelaea, was a subspecies of the spotted hyena of Africa, but significantly larger. These hyenas established their dens in caves, where they accumulated bones of their prey and, occasionally, of humans. In some European caves, human bones have been found with hyena tooth marks, a somber reminder that we were not always the predators. And then there were the other humans, because we were not alone. The Pleistocene was an era of human diversity that we have almost entirely lost. Neanderthals had evolved in Europe over hundreds of thousands of years, adapting to the continent's cold and changing climate. They were robust, muscular, with brains as large or larger than ours. They made sophisticated tools, buried their dead, cared for the sick and injured. Some evidence suggests they created art and personal ornaments. They hunted European megafauna with hand spears, getting dangerously close to their prey in ambushes that required coordination and courage. The Neanderthal body was a marvel of cold adaptation. Their stocky build, with short limbs and a barrel chest, minimized heat loss in the frigid European winters. Their large nose may have warmed and humidified cold air before it reached their lungs. Their muscles were denser than ours, their bones thicker and stronger. A Neanderthal male in his prime would have been extraordinarily powerful by modern human standards, capable of feats of strength that would challenge today's athletes. Their technology, while simpler than later human innovations, was sophisticated and effective. The Mousterian tool industry, named after a site in France, produced carefully shaped stone flakes used for cutting, scraping, and processing animal hides. Neanderthals knew how to produce birch bark tar, a adhesive that requires careful temperature control, suggesting a level of chemical understanding we had not credited them with until recently. Some sites show evidence of compound tools, stone points hafted onto wooden shafts with resin and plant fibers. And they may have had something approaching symbolic thought. At Cueva de los Aviones in Spain, archaeologists have found shells pierced for hanging as ornaments, some stained with red and yellow pigments. At Gorham's Cave in Gibraltar, geometric scratches on the rock wall appear to be intentional, possibly symbolic. In several sites, eagle talons show signs of having been worn as jewelry. These are not the behaviors of mindless brutes. They suggest beings who cared about appearance, who perhaps thought about meanings beyond the immediate practical. Neanderthal bones show a characteristic pattern of injuries, healed fractures, cranial trauma, wounds consistent with those suffered by modern rodeo cowboys. They were close contact hunters, and they paid the price, but they also show evidence of community care. Individuals with disabling injuries survived for years, fed and protected by their groups. At Shanidar Cave in Iraq, one skeleton shows a man who had lost the use of one arm, suffered a severe head injury, and was partially blind, yet lived into old age. Someone had to care for him, feed him, protect him. This is not the behavior of animals. It is the behavior of beings with deep social bonds, perhaps even something we might recognize as compassion. To the east, in the caves of the Altai Mountains in Siberia, lived the Denisovans. We know them mainly from fragments of DNA extracted from tiny bones and teeth found in a cave that bears their name. But that DNA tells a fascinating story. Denisovans were related to Neanderthals but were a distinct lineage, separated by hundreds of thousands of years of evolution. They dispersed across Asia, from Siberia to Southeast Asia, perhaps even to the Pacific Islands. In 2019, scientists announced the discovery of a Denisovan jawbone in a cave on the Tibetan Plateau, more than 3,000 meters above sea level. It showed that Denisovans had adapted to high-altitude environments tens of thousands of years before modern humans arrived. They carried genetic variants that helped them survive where oxygen is scarce, variants they would later pass on to us through interbreeding. We know so little about the Denisovans. We do not know what they looked like, beyond some hints from their DNA that they had dark skin, brown hair, and brown eyes. We do not know how they lived, what tools they made, what they believed. They are ghosts, glimpsed only through fragments of bone and strands of genetic code. Yet they were real people, with lives as complex as ours, who loved and suffered and eventually vanished from the earth. And there were others. Homo floresiensis, the hobbit of Indonesia, a meter-tall human relative that survived on the island of Flores until perhaps 50,000 years ago. Homo luzonensis in the Philippines, known only from teeth and bones found in a cave. Homo naledi in South Africa, with its strange mixture of primitive and modern features. The more we look, the more human species we find, a diversity we had never imagined. Once, the Earth teemed with different kinds of humans. Now, there is only one. And most extraordinarily, we interbred with them and with Neanderthals. The genome of non-African modern humans contains between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA. Asian and Oceanian populations also carry Denisovan DNA, with Papuans of New Guinea reaching up to 5%. We are hybrids. We are not a pure species that replace the others. We are the product of encounters, crossings, mixtures between lineages that had been separated for hundreds of thousands of years. Some of those inherited genes benefit us. Certain immune system variants that protect us from infections came from Neanderthals. Tibetans carry a Denisovan gene that allows them to survive at the extreme altitudes of the Himalayas, where oxygen is scarce. We literally carry in our cells the heritage of those other humans who no longer exist. But eventually, they disappeared. The last Neanderthals went extinct approximately 40,000 years ago, though some isolated populations may have survived a few thousand years longer in the peninsulas of southern Europe. Denisovans disappeared at some similar time. By the end of the Pleistocene, Homo sapiens was the only human left. Why did we survive and not they? It is one of the most difficult questions to answer in paleoanthropology. Perhaps we had subtle technological advantages, more effective projectile weapons, broader social networks that allowed sharing information and resources. Perhaps we were simply more numerous, able to absorb smaller populations through crossbreeding and assimilation. Perhaps the extreme climate changes of the late Pleistocene favored us in some way. Or perhaps it was simply luck. The history of evolution is full of lineages that disappeared not because they were inferior, but because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. What we do know is that when modern humans expanded across the world, we carried unprecedented capabilities with us. We were capable of living in almost any environment, from the tropics to the Arctic, from coasts to the highest mountains. We found ways to survive. We made clothing, built shelters, mastered fire. We could hunt any prey, from mammoths to rabbits. We could fish, gather shellfish, store food for times of scarcity. We were capable of transmitting information between generations with increasing precision. Language, fully developed in our species, allowed teaching complex techniques, sharing knowledge about territory, planning future actions, telling stories that created social cohesion. Each generation could build on what the previous one had learned, an accumulative process that no other species could match. And we were deadly effective as predators. The relationship between the arrival of humans and the extinction of Pleistocene megafauna is one of the most intense debates in paleontology. The basic facts are these. During the last 50,000 years or so, most mammals over 45 kilograms have gone extinct on all continents except Africa. The chronology of these extinctions correlates disturbingly with the arrival of humans in each region. Australia lost its megafauna approximately 46,000 years ago, shortly after the first humans arrived on the continent. And what megafauna it was: Diprotodon optatum, the largest marsupial that ever existed, was the size of a hippopotamus and weighed nearly 3 tons. It was a giant relative of the modern wombat, with robust legs, broad claws, and a massive head with protruding incisors it used to tear vegetation. It roamed Australia's forests and prairies in herds, leaving footprints the size of plates in wet soil. Its fossils are found throughout the continent, evidence that it was extraordinarily abundant before humans arrived. Procoptodon goliath was a kangaroo, but a kangaroo unlike any that exists today. It measured more than 2 meters tall and weighed more than 200 kilograms. Its face was short, almost flattened, with forward-facing eyes like a primate's. Unlike modern kangaroos, which hop on their hind legs, Procoptodon probably walked, putting one foot in front of the other. Its arms were long, with fingers adapted for grasping branches and bringing them to its mouth. It was a high canopy browser, a niche that no living kangaroo occupies. Thylacolion carnifex, the marsupial lion, was the supreme predator of Pleistocene Australia. It was not a lion at all, but a leopard-sized carnivorous marsupial with the most powerful jaws proportional to its size of any known mammal. Its upper premolars had evolved into cutting blades capable of slicing flesh and bone. Its thumbs bore retractable claws similar to a cat's. It was an ambush predator, probably capable of climbing trees and launching itself onto prey from above. Megalania prisca was a lizard, a monitor, like the Komodo dragon, but enlarged to terrifying proportions. Size estimates vary, but the largest specimens may have reached 6 meters in length and 500 kilograms in weight. It was the largest terrestrial lizard since the age of dinosaurs, a predator capable of hunting even juvenile diprotodons. Some research suggests that, like the modern Komodo dragon, Megalania had a venomous bite that weakened its prey while pursuing them with reptilian patience. Genurnus newtoni was a flightless bird, 2 meters tall and 200 kilograms in weight, related to modern ducks and geese, but adapted to a completely terrestrial lifestyle. Its eggs, almost the size of a soccer ball, have been found in deposits throughout Australia. Some show signs of having been cooked, direct evidence that the first Australians collected them as food. All these animals disappeared. In a period of a few thousand years, Australian megafauna vanished, leaving only fragments of bone and the persistent question of what exactly happened. The Americas lost their megafauna about 13,000 years ago, coinciding with the arrival of the first humans via the Bering Land Bridge. The list of the extinct is astonishing. American mastodons, different from mammoths, preferred the forests of the eastern continent. They were smaller than mammoths, with less curved tusks and teeth adapted for grinding leaves and branches instead of grass. They had survived in North America for millions of years through countless climatic fluctuations, but they did not survive humans. The giant ground sloth, Megatherium americanum, was a creature of impossible proportions. The size of an elephant, it weighed more than 4 tons and could stand on its hind legs to reach leaves 6 meters high. Its claws, up to 50 centimeters long, were formidable weapons, though it probably used them mainly for pulling down branches. It was the third largest land mammal that ever existed, surpassed only by elephants and the giant rhinos of the Oligocene. Different species of ground sloths lived from Alaska to Patagonia, each adapted to its local environment. Glyptodon, the giant armadillo, wandered the South American pampas with its impenetrable shell. Its tail ended in a spiked, bony mass that functioned like a medieval mace. Some fossils show signs of combat between glyptodonts, shells with impact marks consistent with tail blows. They were peaceful herbivores, but perfectly capable of defending themselves when necessary. The American lion, Panthera atrox, was the largest cat of the Pleistocene, even larger than the European cave lion. It hunted in the North American prairies, probably in family groups like its modern African cousins. Its claws and fangs have been found alongside bones of horses, bison, and camelids. And there were so many others. The short-faced bear Arctodus, the largest terrestrial carnivore of the Americas. The giant beaver Casteroides, the size of a black bear. The flat-headed peccary. The American tapir, multiple species of horses. Camelids of various sizes. Giant antilocuprids. Capybaras, twice the current size. All of them disappeared. In the span of a few thousand years, North America lost approximately 35% of its large mammal genera. South America lost even more. It was one of the fastest and most complete extinctions in recent Earth history. Madagascar lost its giant lemurs and elephant birds approximately 1,000 years ago, when the first humans colonized the island. New Zealand lost its moas, giant flightless birds, and its Haast's eagle, the largest bird of prey that ever existed, about 700 years ago after the arrival of Polynesians. The story of the moas and the Haast's eagle is particularly poignant. For millions of years, New Zealand was a world without mammalian predators. The only land mammals were bats. In the absence of mammals, birds evolved to fill every ecological niche. There were kiwis that rooted through leaf litter like hedgehogs, kakapas that climbed trees like squirrels, wrens that hopped through the undergrowth like mice, and there were moas, which filled the role of large herbivores. At least 9 species of moa existed when humans arrived, ranging from turkey-sized Anomalopteryx to the giant Dinornis robustus. Standing over 3.5 meters tall and weighing perhaps 230 kilograms, they had no wings at all, not even vestigial ones. Their feathers were simple and hair-like, more for insulation than flight. They had no need for defenses, no predators to fear, except the magnificent Haast's eagle. The Haast's eagle was a monster by any avian standard. Females, larger than males, weighed up to 15 kilograms, with a wingspan of nearly 3 meters. Their talons were as large as a tiger's claws, their beaks hooked for tearing flesh. Genetic analysis has shown they were closely related to the much smaller little eagle of Australia, their giant size and adaptation to hunting giant prey. They would dive from above, striking moas with tremendous force, using their massive talons to pierce vital organs. It was a perfect predator-prey relationship, evolved over millions of years of isolation. Then humans arrived. The Maori reached New Zealand around 1280 AD. Within 2 centuries, every species of moa was gone. The archaeological record is unambiguous. Moa bones appear in the earliest human sites, many showing butchery marks. Piles of moa bones, some containing remains of hundreds of individuals, mark the processing sites where hunters rendered their kills. Eggshells were used as water containers. Feathers were made into cloaks. The moas, which had never seen a ground predator, would have been absurdly easy to hunt. They probably did not even run away. When the moas vanished, the Haast's eagle lost its prey base. Within decades of the last moa's disappearance, the eagles were gone too. Maori oral tradition speaks of a great bird called the puakai that attacked humans. Perhaps the eagles, desperate for food as moa populations collapsed, turned to hunting the new 2-legged prey. If so, they were the last great predators of humans in New Zealand and the first to be hunted to extinction by the people they preyed upon. Similar stories played out across the Pacific. Every inhabited island shows the same pattern: human arrival, followed by rapid extinction of endemic species. Hawaii lost more than 50 species of birds, including flightless geese, giant owls, and a unique crow. The Society Islands, Marquesas, Easter Island, Fiji, Tonga all tell the same tale. The Pacific expansion of Polynesian peoples was accompanied by one of the greatest extinction waves in Earth history, a tragedy largely invisible to Western science until archaeologists began excavating Pacific Island sites. The pattern is consistent, too consistent to be coincidence. But not all scientists are convinced that humans are the only culprits. The late Pleistocene also saw dramatic climate changes. The last glacial maximum, about 20,000 years ago, was followed by rapid warming that transformed ecosystems worldwide. The mammoth steppe, which supported much of the northern megafauna, fragmented and shrank as the climate warmed. The debate between climate and human causation has raged for decades, with passionate advocates on both sides. Those who favor climate as the primary driver point to the severity of the warming that ended the last ice age. Temperatures rose by perhaps 6 degrees Celsius over just a few thousand years, a rate of change that would stress any ecosystem. The mammoth steppe, that vast cold grassland that had supported woolly mammoths, woolly rhinos, steppe bison, horses, and their predators, contracted dramatically as forests expanded northward. Many megafauna species were adapted to this specific ecosystem. When it disappeared, they had nowhere to go. Moreover, climate advocates note there had been previous interglacial periods during the Pleistocene when temperatures rose to similar levels. Yet, the megafauna had survived those earlier warm periods. Why should the most recent warming be different? Perhaps, they suggest, this particular warming was especially severe, or especially rapid, or coincided with other stresses that made survival impossible. Those who favor humans as the primary driver point to the suspicious timing. If climate were the cause, we would expect extinctions to correlate with climate changes, but they do not. The megafauna extinctions correlate almost perfectly with human arrival, regardless of climate. Australia's megafauna went extinct during a relatively stable climate period. The American extinctions occurred during rapid warming, but also coincided precisely with human arrival. Madagascar and New Zealand lost their megafauna during periods of stable climate, but right after humans arrived. The Caribbean islands lost their giant sloths and rodents precisely when humans colonized each island, often thousands of years after the continental extinctions. Furthermore, human advocates point out the modern extinctions of the past few centuries have occurred during a relatively stable climate. The dodo, the Steller's sea cow, the great auk, the thylacine, the passenger pigeon, all went extinct because of human hunting or habitat destruction, not climate change. Why should we assume that prehistoric humans were incapable of the same impacts? The truth probably involves both factors. Climate changes weakened and fragmented megafauna populations. Humans provided the final blow. We were effective hunters, capable of organizing coordinated hunts, of using fire to manipulate landscapes, of pursuing prey to exhaustion. For animals that had evolved without human predation pressure, we were a completely new type of threat, one for which they had no evolutionary defense. This synergy between climate stress and human hunting may explain why the extinctions were so severe and so rapid. Neither factor alone might have been sufficient to drive the megafauna to extinction, but together they were devastating. A mammoth population reduced and fragmented by shrinking habitat would be much more vulnerable to human hunting than a large connected population. Human hunters, even with primitive technology, could eliminate the remaining populations one by one. The result was devastating. In a few thousand years, most of the megafauna that had defined the Pleistocene disappeared forever. Africa is the notable exception. Here, megafauna largely survived, though with losses. Elephants, rhinoceroses, hippos, lions, leopards, hyenas, cheetahs, zebras, giraffes, buffalo, all still exist. The most likely explanation is that African fauna evolved alongside hominids for millions of years. They had time to develop behaviors that protected them from humans. African elephants are notoriously wary of humans, and with good reason. African lions rarely attack people unless desperate or provoked. These behaviors are not coincidence. They are the product of millions of years of coevolution with increasingly dangerous human hunters. Animals on other continents, which had never seen a bipedal predator with spears, did not have that advantage. When humans arrived, they simply did not recognize us as a threat. The giant ground sloths of the Americas, the diprotodons of Australia, the moas of New Zealand, all would have encountered humans with no instinctive fear, no evolved wariness. They would have been easy prey, standing placidly as hunters approached with spears or clubs. By the time they might have learned to fear humans, it was too late. Their populations were already too small, too fragmented, to recover. And so we arrive at the Holocene, the epoch in which we live. It began about 11,700 years ago, when the great ice sheets of the north began their final retreat. It is, in geological terms, a blink. But in that blink, everything has changed. Humans went from being hunter-gatherers living in small, mobile groups to being sedentary farmers. Agriculture arose independently in multiple places around the world. The Fertile Crescent, China, Mesoamerica, the Andes, West Africa. With agriculture came population growth, cities, civilizations, writing, technology, and with human growth came the transformation of the planet. The domestication of animals was one of the most profound revolutions in the history of mammals. It began with the dog, probably more than 15,000 years ago, when some wolves began to associate with human groups. It is not clear whether it was humans who adopted wolf pups or wolves who approached human camps in search of scraps. Perhaps it happened both ways in different places and times. What we do know is that the result was an unprecedented association between two species of predatory mammals. Dogs became our hunting companions, our guardians, eventually our pets. Over thousands of years, we shaped them according to our needs and whims, creating a diversity of forms ranging from the Chihuahua to the Great Dane, more extreme variations than exist between any wild canid species. The dog is, in a sense, our first biological creation, the first organism we deliberately modified according to our desires. Then came sheep, domesticated about 11,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent region. Then goats, pigs, cattle. Each of these animals was transformed by human selection. We made them more docile, easier to handle, more productive. A wild bull, the aurochs, was a formidable beast capable of killing a man with its horns. Its domestic descendants, modern dairy cows, are so dependent on humans that many could not survive without us. The horse was domesticated about 6,000 years ago in the steppes of Central Asia. It is an extraordinary evolutionary irony. Horses evolved in North America over 50 million years, dispersed to Eurasia via the Bering Land Bridge, and then went extinct in their native continent when humans arrived about 13,000 years ago. It was the Eurasian descendants that were domesticated, and it was those domestic horses that the Spanish brought back to the Americas 500 years ago, returning the genus Equus to the land where it had evolved. The Bactrian camel and dromedary were domesticated in Central Asia and the Arabian Peninsula, respectively. South American camelids, the llama and alpaca, were independently domesticated in the Andes. They are the only large mammals domesticated outside Eurasia, and their existence allowed Andean civilizations to develop without the advantages of horses or cattle. The cat came later, perhaps 9,000 years ago, when the first farmers of the Fertile Crescent began to store grain. Wild cats were attracted to the rodents that infested the granaries, and humans tolerated and even favored their presence. It is the only domestication of a large felid, and unlike dogs, cats retain much of their wild behavior. They are, as some scientists joke, only semi-domestic. But domestication had a cost. Domestic animals replaced wild ones. Where once there were aurochs, now there are cows. Where once there were wild horses, now there are domestic horses. The wild progenitors of many domestic species went extinct or were reduced to relict populations. The mouflon, ancestor of the domestic sheep, survives only on a few Mediterranean islands. The aurochs went extinct in 1627, when the last specimen died in a forest in Poland. Meanwhile, on the world's islands, humans were writing the most tragic chapters of the extinction story. Islands are evolutionary laboratories. Isolated from continents, they develop unique faunas, often with species that exist nowhere else. But that same uniqueness makes them vulnerable. Island animals evolve without continental predators, and when those predators arrive, they often have no defenses. They have no instinctive fear, no escape behaviors, no weapons evolved through millions of years of predator-prey arms races. They are, in a very real sense, innocent, and innocence is fatal when killers arrive. The physics of islands conspire to make their species especially vulnerable. Island populations are inherently small, limited by the available land area. Small populations are genetically fragile, with less variation to cope with new challenges. Small populations can be driven to extinction by random fluctuations, by bad weather, by disease, by any stressor that a larger population could absorb. When humans arrive with hunting pressure that even a continental population would struggle with, island species simply have no chance. Madagascar separated from Africa more than 150 million years ago, and its fauna evolved in almost complete isolation. Lemurs, primitive primates that disappeared from the African continent when more advanced monkeys evolved, thrived in Madagascar without competition. Some reached extraordinary sizes. Archaeoindris was a lemur the size of a male gorilla, the largest primate that ever existed outside the great apes. It was a ground-dwelling species, too heavy to climb, probably living in small groups in Madagascar's forests. Megalodapus was the size of an orangutan and clung to tree trunks with its powerful limbs. Its face was elongated like a cow's, with eyes on the sides of its head rather than facing forward. It probably fed by pulling branches toward its mouth while braced against tree trunks. Nothing like it exists today. Nothing like it had existed for millions of years on any continent. Paleopropithecus was a sloth lemur, with arms longer than its legs and curved fingers adapted for hanging beneath branches. It moved through the forest canopy, much like a living sloth, slowly and deliberately, feeding on leaves and fruits. There were several species, ranging from the size of a howler monkey to the size of a chimpanzee. There were also elephant birds, the largest that ever existed. Vorum titan weighed more than 700 kilograms and stood more than 3 meters tall. It laid eggs the size of soccer balls, the largest any vertebrate has ever produced. Those eggs have been found intact, and some have been carbon dated to times after human arrival, suggesting humans may have collected them for food. A single elephant bird egg could feed an entire family. Other elephant bird species were smaller, but still impressive. Apiornis maximus, long thought to be the largest, weighed perhaps half a ton. Mullornis was smaller still, perhaps 100 kilograms. Together, they occupied ecological niches that on continents would belong to large mammalian herbivores. They browsed vegetation, dispersed seeds, shaped the forest structure through their feeding habits. Madagascar also had its own unique carnivores, the euplerids, related to the mongooses of Africa but evolved in isolation into forms that filled the niches of cats, civets, and foxes. The fossa, the largest surviving euplerion, is about the size of a small cougar and is the island's top predator today. But before humans arrived, the largest euplerids were probably limited to prey smaller than the giant lemurs. The giant lemurs had no serious predators. They had never needed to evolve defenses against hunting pressure. When humans arrived in Madagascar, approximately 2,000 years ago, all this changed. In less than 1,000 years, the giant lemurs disappeared. At least 17 species of lemurs went extinct, all of them larger than any surviving species. The elephant birds went extinct. Madagascar's dwarf hippos, an endemic species that had evolved from African ancestors, vanished. Giant tortoises disappeared. The ecosystem was decapitated, losing its largest and most unique members, while smaller species persisted. The extinction was not instantaneous. Radiocarbon dates suggest that some giant lemur populations survived for several centuries after human arrival, gradually declining as forests were cleared for agriculture and hunting pressure accumulated. The elephant birds may have persisted even longer in remote areas, but the end result was the same. A unique ecosystem that had taken millions of years to develop was destroyed in a geological sigh. New Zealand was even more dramatic. This archipelago separated from Gondwana more than 80 million years ago, before modern terrestrial mammals evolved. As a result, New Zealand had no native mammals except bats. Instead, birds occupied all ecological niches. There were moas, flightless birds that filled the role of browsing herbivores, from species the size of a turkey to giants, nearly 4 meters tall and 250 kilograms in weight. There were 9 species of moas, each adapted to different habitats and different food sources. The largest, Dinornis robustus and Dinornis novaezelandiae, were the tallest birds that ever existed. Standing upright, they could reach vegetation 3 meters above the ground. Their necks were long and flexible, their beaks adapted for stripping leaves from branches. They probably lived in pairs or small family groups, wandering through New Zealand's forests and grasslands with no fear of predators. Because there were no mammalian predators, New Zealand's top predator was a bird, Haast's eagle, Hieratus morai, the largest known bird of prey, with a 3-meter wingspan and talons capable of piercing a moa's pelvis. Haast's eagle probably hunted by diving from above, striking moas in the back and gripping with those enormous talons until the prey collapsed from blood loss. It was an apex predator, perfectly adapted to its ecosystem, completely dependent on moas for food. New Zealand also had giant geese that could not fly, giant rails, giant parrots, an entire community of unique birds that had evolved in splendid isolation for millions of years. Some were fearless of predators because they had never encountered any. Others relied on camouflage or hiding rather than flight. None were prepared for what was coming. Polynesians arrived in New Zealand approximately 700 years ago. They brought with them dogs and rats, both of which preyed on ground-nesting birds, and they hunted. Archaeological sites contain vast quantities of moa bones, many showing signs of butchering. The Maori ate moas, used their bones for tools and ornaments, their feathers for cloaks and decorations. Within 1 or 2 centuries, the moas were gone. All 9 species, from the small bush moas to the towering Dinornis, extinct. Without moas, Haast's eagle lost its main food source and also disappeared. The entire ecosystem collapsed. The giant geese, the giant rails, countless other species, all followed the moas into extinction. An entire ecosystem, millions of years of isolated evolution, erased in a few human generations. Pacific Islands tell similar stories. Hawaii lost more than half of its native bird species after Polynesian arrival, including an entire radiation of flightless ibises, flightless geese, and bizarre honey creepers adapted to every ecological niche. The Mascarenes, islands in the Indian Ocean, lost the dodo and the Rodrigues solitaire, flightless birds that evolved in the absence of predators and had no fear of humans. The dodo has become the symbol of human-caused extinction, a bird that walked trustingly toward its own destruction because it had never learned to fear. The Caribbean lost its giant ground sloths, giant rodents, and endemic primates. The Mediterranean lost its dwarf elephants and dwarf hippos. Wherever humans went, extinction followed. The pattern is so consistent that paleontologists can often predict when humans arrived on an island by looking at when its megafauna disappeared. Even today, extinctions continue. The northern white rhino was reduced to 2 females, unable to reproduce. The Javan tiger went extinct in the 1980s. The western black rhino was declared extinct in 2011. The Asiatic lion survives only in a small forest in India, with fewer than 700 individuals. The snow leopard, orangutan, mountain gorilla, Sumatran rhino, all are on the brink of extinction. Today, humans and our domestic animals constitute approximately 96% of terrestrial mammal biomass. Wild mammals, from mice to elephants, represent only the remaining 4%. We have converted more than half of the planet's habitable land surface into agricultural land or urban areas. We have altered the nitrogen, carbon, and water cycles. We have caused what many scientists consider the sixth mass extinction in Earth's history. But here is where we must stop and consider the story we have just traversed. 66 million years ago, an asteroid struck Earth and killed 3/4 of all species on the planet. The dinosaurs, who had dominated for 160 million years, disappeared. And from the ashes of that apocalypse emerged small furry creatures that no one would have chosen as heirs to the world. Those creatures diversified in extraordinary ways. Some returned to the ocean and became the largest whales that have ever existed. Others developed membranous wings and conquered the night as bats. Others grew to gigantic sizes, from the Indracotherium of the Asian steppes to the ground sloths of the Americas. Others developed increasingly complex brains, increasingly skilled hands, increasingly upright posture. And one of those lines, against all odds, produced a species capable of looking back in time and reconstructing this story, capable of understanding where it came from, capable of asking where it is going. That species is you. Think about this for a moment. Your existence depends on an unbroken chain of survival extending back 66 million years. If a single ancestor of yours, at any point in that chain, had died before reproducing, you would not be here. Every predator evaded, every glaciation survived, every drought overcome, every disease survived was necessary for your existence. And before that chain, there was another. The dinosaurs had to go extinct for mammals to inherit the Earth. But if the asteroid had arrived a little earlier or a little later, if it had struck the ocean instead of dry land, if it had been a little smaller or a little larger, the story could have been completely different. The contingency of evolution is astonishing. There was no guarantee that mammals would dominate after the dinosaurs. There was no guarantee that primates would arise. There was no guarantee that one of those primates would develop a brain capable of science, art, philosophy. In a universe of infinite possibilities, this particular sequence of events occurred. And here we are. But our story has not ended. We are heirs to 66 million years of mammalian evolution, but we are also agents of change on a scale unprecedented since that Cretaceous asteroid. Scientists debate whether we have entered a new geological epoch, the Anthropocene, defined by human impact on the planet. We have altered the atmosphere, acidified the oceans, transformed landscapes, moved species between continents, extinguished many others. The rate of change we are causing rivals the most catastrophic events of the geological past. Consider the figures for a moment. Before the arrival of humans, the background extinction rate, the natural pace at which species disappeared and were replaced by new ones, was approximately 1 species per million species per year. Today, the most conservative estimates suggest the rate is at least 100 times higher. The most alarming propose 1,000 times higher. We are living through a mass extinction, the sixth in Earth's history, and we are the ones causing it. In the last 500 years, approximately 1,000 known vertebrate species have gone extinct. Countless invertebrates and plants have disappeared without us even naming them. And for every extinct species, dozens more are on the brink. The tiger, which a century ago roamed from Turkey to the Pacific Ocean, now survives in fragmented populations, totaling perhaps 4,000 individuals. The Bornean orangutan has lost 80% of its population in 3 human generations. Wild vertebrate populations overall have declined approximately 69% since 1970. These numbers are abstract, hard to feel emotionally, but they represent the disappearance of lineages that had persisted for millions of years. Each species that disappears is the end of a unique evolutionary story, a branch of the tree of life pruned forever. The genes, behaviors, adaptations they contained disappear with them, unrecoverable. But there is a crucial difference between our situation and past mass extinctions. Unlike the asteroid, we can choose. We can decide what kind of heirs we want to be of this extraordinary planet. There are already signs of hope, though tentative. The bald eagle, symbol of the United States, was on the brink of extinction in the 1960s due to DDT and human persecution. Protection measures have returned it to healthy numbers. The American bison, which numbered in the tens of millions before European arrival and was reduced to a few hundred, now numbers several 100,000 thanks to conservation programs. The gray wolf is gradually returning to territories from which it had been exterminated. Reforestation efforts in some parts of the world are restoring habitats that seemed lost forever. These stories demonstrate that the damage is not always irreversible. They demonstrate that when we choose to act, we can reverse decline. They demonstrate that the future is not yet written. We can protect the last strongholds of megafauna that survived the Pleistocene extinctions. We can restore degraded ecosystems. We can reduce our impact on climate. We can create a future where mammals, including ourselves, can continue to thrive. Or we can continue down the current path toward an impoverished world where only the species we have domesticated or that can tolerate our presence survive. The choice is ours, and it is perhaps the most important decision any species has faced in 66 million years. When you look at an elephant, you are looking at a survivor. A descendant of the proboscideans that emerged in the Eocene, that conquered continents, that faced glaciations and climate changes and the arrival of humans. That elephant carries in its genes the history of millions of years of adaptation and survival. But more than that, you are looking at an individual with its own personality, its own memories, its own relationships. Elephants recognize hundreds of other elephants as individuals. They remember friends and enemies for decades. They mourn their dead, returning to the bones of fallen family members year after year, touching the remains gently with their trunks in what can only be described as grief. They cooperate in raising young, with experienced females serving as midwives and teachers. They communicate in infrasound, frequencies too low for human ears, across distances of miles. When we drive elephants toward extinction, we are not just losing a species. We are destroying minds, communities, cultures. We are ending stories that stretch back millions of years. We are silencing voices that have much to teach us about what it means to be intelligent, social, and alive on this planet. When you look at a whale, you are looking at an evolutionary miracle. A mammal whose ancestor walked on 4 legs 50 million years ago, that decided to return to the ocean, that transformed from a terrestrial creature to a supreme swimmer, that reached sizes greater than any dinosaur that ever existed. The blue whale, the largest animal ever known to exist, can reach lengths of over 30 meters and weights of nearly 200 tons. Its heart is the size of a small car. Its tongue alone weighs as much as an elephant. Its arteries are wide enough for a human to crawl through. It feeds on krill, tiny crustaceans barely a few centimeters long, filtering millions of them from the water through its baleen plates. It is an impossibility made flesh, a creature so large that it could only exist in the supporting medium of water, where gravity's demands are reduced. Blue whales nearly went extinct due to commercial whaling in the 20th century. From an estimated population of over 200,000 before industrial hunting began, they were reduced to a few thousand by the 1960s. International protections have allowed their numbers to slowly recover, but they remain endangered. Their songs, which can travel across entire ocean basins, are now heard less frequently than they once were. Humpback whales have the most complex songs in the animal kingdom, elaborate sequences of sounds lasting up to 20 minutes that they repeat for hours. These songs evolve over time, with new phrases spreading through populations like cultural fads. Different populations have different songs, different traditions, different ways of hunting. Some groups have learned to create bubble nets, curtains of rising bubbles that concentrate fish for easy feeding. Others cooperate to drive prey toward the surface. These techniques are not instinctive. They are learned, passed down from generation to generation. They are culture. Sperm whales have the largest brains ever to exist on Earth, 6 times larger than human brains. They live in matrilineal family groups, led by experienced females who know where to find food across thousands of miles of open ocean. They have distinct dialects, clicking patterns that identify their family group, like accents or surnames. Young whales learn these patterns from their mothers and aunts. When families from different regions meet, they can recognize whether the other group is friend or stranger by the sounds they make. We are only beginning to understand the minds that exist in the ocean, and we are running out of time to learn from them. When you look at a bat, you are looking at the only mammalian conquest of true flight. An adaptation so radical, so improbable, that it has occurred only 3 times in the history of terrestrial life: in insects, in pterosaurs, in birds, and in these small mammals that navigated the night skies when dinosaurs still dominated the Earth. Bats are the only mammals capable of true powered flight, as opposed to the gliding of flying squirrels or sugar gliders. Their wings are formed from highly modified hands, with elongated finger bones supporting a thin membrane of skin. When you watch a bat fly, you are watching evolution's solution to a problem that only 4 groups of organisms have ever solved: how to stay aloft through active locomotion. There are more than 1,400 species of bats, making them the second largest order of mammals after rodents. They occupy almost every ecological niche imaginable for a flying creature. Fruit bats pollinate tropical flowers and disperse seeds across vast distances. Insectivorous bats consume astronomical quantities of insects, providing pest control worth billions of dollars to agriculture. Vampire bats, feeding on blood, have evolved the ability to share regurgitated blood meals with hungry roostmates, a form of reciprocal altruism that astonished scientists when first discovered. Fishing bats use echolocation to detect ripples on the water's surface and snatch fish with their clawed feet. Echolocation itself is one of the most remarkable adaptations in the animal kingdom. Bats emit ultrasonic pulses and listen to the echoes to build a sonic picture of their surroundings. They can detect objects as thin as human hair. They can distinguish between species of insects by the pattern of their wing beats. They can navigate through total darkness, catching prey on the wing, avoiding obstacles, locating roost sites. It is a sensory world we can barely imagine, a universe of sound that humans cannot perceive. And yet, bats are among the most threatened mammals on Earth. White nose syndrome, a fungal disease, has killed millions of bats in North America. Habitat loss threatens colonies around the world. Wind turbines kill hundreds of thousands of bats each year. Many people still fear and persecute these remarkable creatures, not understanding their ecological importance or the wonder of their biology. When you look at any mammal, you are looking at a survivor. You are looking at the product of 66 million years of evolution since the dinosaurs fell. You are looking at a being whose ancestors overcame every challenge that Earth could throw at them. Asteroid impacts, climate swings, predators, competitors, diseases, and in recent millennia, us. Each mammal species that exists today represents an unbroken chain of survival, stretching back to those small creatures hiding in Cretaceous burrows. And when you look at yourself, you are looking at the most improbable of all survivors. A species that started on one continent, that dispersed across the entire planet, that transformed its environment in ways no other creature has achieved. A species that learned to tell stories, to transmit knowledge across generations, to dream of the past and plan for the future. A species that can understand its own origin and reflect on its destiny. For better or worse, we are the most extraordinary result of the age of mammals. The Cenozoic continues. The climate changes ahead will transform ecosystems in ways we cannot yet fully predict. The species that survive will be those capable of adapting, or those lucky enough that their habitats remain relatively stable. What forms will evolution take in a future we will not see? Speculation is inevitable, and perhaps instructive. If humans disappeared tomorrow, leaving a warmed planet but empty of our dominant presence, life would recover. It has done so before. The niches we occupy would be filled by other lineages. Perhaps crows, with their remarkably large brains and demonstrated tool-using ability, would evolve toward more complex forms. Perhaps octopuses, those creatures of disturbing intelligence that evolved along completely different paths from ours, would colonize new environments. Perhaps rodents, those supreme survivors that have thrived in every environment humans have imposed on them, would inherit the earth. Consider the remarkable capabilities that already exist in the animal world. Elephants show signs of self-awareness, using tools, recognizing themselves in mirrors, mourning their dead in ways that seem eerily familiar. Dolphins call each other by individual signature whistles, essentially names, and have complex social hierarchies we are only beginning to understand. Orcas have distinct cultures, different groups specializing in different hunting techniques passed down through generations. Bonobos and chimpanzees use tools, plan for the future, and engage in what looks very much like politics. Corvids, the crows and ravens and jays, solve puzzles that stump human children, remember individual human faces for years, and teach their young which humans are dangerous. Intelligence, it seems, evolves more readily than we once thought. Given enough time and the right selective pressures, who knows what could emerge? Some scientists have speculated about the distant future of mammalian evolution. If horses survive and humans do not, might they eventually develop larger brains and more flexible limbs? If elephants persist, might their trunks become ever more dexterous, their social organizations ever more complex? If marine mammals continue their remarkable trajectory, might whales one day develop something that functions like hands, tool use, technology? These are fantasies, of course. Evolution does not work according to our expectations. It does not progress towards some predetermined goal. It simply responds to the pressures of the moment, selecting for whatever works, whatever survives, whatever reproduces. The future is not written. It cannot be predicted. It can only be lived. Or perhaps completely unpredictable life forms would arise, as strange to our imagination as whales would have been to those small Paleocene mammals, as unexpected as we would have been to Lucy as she walked across the Ethiopian savannas 3 million years ago. What we do know is that life finds a way. It has been doing so for 4 billion years. It has survived asteroid impacts, global glaciations, massive volcanic eruptions, extinctions that eliminated more than 90% of species, and every time after every catastrophe, it has diversified again, experimented, filled the world with new and astonishing forms. The Great Recovery after the Permian extinction, which killed more than 90% of marine species, gave rise to the dinosaurs. The recovery after the Cretaceous extinction, which ended the dinosaurs' reign, gave rise to mammals. Each catastrophe, terrible as it was for the creatures living through it, opened new possibilities for those that came after. Death made room for life. Extinction made room for evolution. This is not a comforting thought if you are the one being extinguished. The dinosaurs, had they been capable of philosophy, would have found no solace in knowing that their demise would clear the stage for mammals. The mammoths and saber-toothed cats, had they understood their fate, would not have been pleased to learn that their extinction would benefit human expansion. And we, if we drive ourselves to extinction through our own actions, will not be consoled by the thought that something else will eventually take our place. But in a cosmic sense, in the long view of deep time, catastrophe and recovery are simply the rhythm of life on Earth. 66 million years from now, whatever exists will look back on us the way we look back on the dinosaurs. As an interesting chapter in the history of life, a dominant group whose reign eventually ended, making way for something new. Life is resilient in ways we are only beginning to understand, and that resilience should give us hope, but also humility. Hope because it means that whatever happens, life will continue. Humility because it means we are not necessary for it to do so. And the mammals, those small survivors that emerged from the ashes of the Cretaceous apocalypse, will continue evolving. In 1 million years, there will be species that do not exist today. In 10 million years, current lineages will have transformed in ways we cannot imagine. In 100 million years, if life follows its normal course, there will be a world as different from ours as ours is from the world of the dinosaurs. We will not be here to see it. Like all species, ours has a limited duration. Typical mammal species last between 1 and 10 million years before going extinct or evolving into something different. Homo sapiens is about 300,000 years old. We are young, evolutionarily speaking, but no species is eternal. The fossil record teaches us humility. Species that dominated their ecosystems for millions of years eventually disappeared, replaced by descendants that would have been unrecognizable to them. The dinosaurs could not have predicted birds. The early primates could not have predicted humans. And we cannot predict what will come after us, whether we go extinct or evolve into something new. But the fossil record also teaches us wonder. Against all odds, life persists. Against all odds, evolution produces forms of astonishing beauty and complexity. Against all odds, a lineage of apes learned to make tools, control fire, build civilizations, and eventually understand the history of their own planet. We are the universe contemplating itself, the product of 14 billion years of cosmic evolution becoming aware of its own story. That awareness carries responsibility. We are the first species that can understand the consequences of our actions, the first that can choose to preserve or destroy the natural world. Previous mass extinctions were caused by asteroids, by volcanoes, by changes in ocean chemistry beyond any organism's control. This mass extinction is different. This mass extinction is a choice. We can choose to protect the endangered species that remain, to preserve the wild places that still exist, to reduce our impact on the climate and the oceans. We can choose to be good ancestors, leaving a world where life can continue to flourish and evolve. Or we can continue on our current path toward a planet dominated by humans and our domestic animals, with wild nature reduced to fragments and memories. The story of Earth after the dinosaurs shows that life recovers from catastrophe. It shows that evolution fills empty niches with new forms, often stranger and more wonderful than what came before. But recovery takes millions of years. Extinction is forever, at least on human timescales. The species we lose today will not return in time for our grandchildren to see them. They will be gone, like the mammoths and the moas and the dodo, existing only in fossils and in stories. We are writing the next chapter of this story right now. With every decision we make about how to live on this planet, we can write a story of destruction and loss, or a story of wisdom and preservation. The choice is ours. What we can do is leave a legacy. We can be the ancestors of something extraordinary, just as those small creatures of the late Cretaceous were our ancestors. We can be a link in a chain that continues into the future. Or we can be a branch that ends, an evolutionary experiment that went too far, too fast, and consumed itself. The story of Earth after the dinosaurs is the story of recovery, adaptation, diversification, extinction, and renewal. It is a story of accumulated improbabilities, of astonishing contingencies, of survival against all odds. It is a story that spans 66 million years across every continent, from the ocean depths to the highest mountains, from tropical rainforests to frozen tundra. It is the story of whales returning to the sea, of bats conquering the night sky, of primates descending from the trees and walking upright across the savanna. It is the story of elephants and their remarkable memories, of wolves and their complex social bonds, of dolphins and their playful intelligence. It is the story of countless species that evolved, flourished, and eventually vanished, leaving only fossils to mark their passage through time. It is the story of Indricotherium towering over the Asian plains, of Megalodon terrorizing the Miocene seas, of terror birds hunting across the South American pampas, of Smilodons stalking the Pleistocene grasslands. It is the story of creatures so strange and wonderful that if they were described in fiction, we might dismiss them as impossible. Yet they were real. They lived and breathed and left their bones in the rocks for us to find. But above all, it is a story of survival, of life persisting through catastrophe, of small creatures inheriting an empty world and transforming it beyond recognition, of evolution's endless creativity, producing forms more strange and wonderful than any imagination could conceive. It is our story, and it is not over. There is something profoundly moving in our capacity to know this story. Think about what paleontology really means. We are creatures that live perhaps 80 years trying to understand events that occurred 66 million years ago. Our lives are less than a blink on the scale of geological time, and yet we have developed methods to read rocks as if they were books, to extract stories from fossilized bones, to reconstruct worlds that no human eye ever saw. The first fossils were interpreted as bones of giants, as remains of dragons, as evidence of divine floods. It took us centuries to understand they were fragments of creatures that had lived and died millions of years before any human existed. It took even longer to accept the implications of that discovery, that life on Earth has a deep history, that species change over time, that we are connected by descent to all other creatures that have existed. Today, with tools that would have seemed like magic to scientists barely a century ago, we can extract DNA from mammoth bones frozen in permafrost. We can determine the color of extinct dinosaur feathers by analyzing fossilized melanosomes. We can reconstruct diets, behaviors, family relationships, diseases of animals dead for millions of years. Every fossil is a window to the past, and our ability to look through that window constantly improves. This capacity to know the deep past is, as far as we know, unique. No other species contemplates fossils and wonders where they come from. No other species reconstructs extinct ecosystems or debates the causes of mass extinctions. We are, as far as we know, the first and only organisms in Earth's history that understand the history of Earth. And that understanding matters, because knowing where we come from helps us understand where we are going. Because the lessons of the past, mass extinctions, climate changes, evolutionary contingencies, are relevant to the future we are creating. Because knowing we are part of a larger story, a story of billions of years of life struggling, adapting, surviving, can give us the perspective we need to make better decisions. 66 million years ago, the sky tore apart over Earth and an entire world died. But from the ashes of that apocalypse, something new arose. Something that would eventually look toward the stars and wonder where it came from. Something that would reconstruct the history of its own origin from fossilized bones and layers of rock. That something is you. You are the heir of the dinosaurs, though they were replaced so you could exist. You are the descendant of creatures that survived the unimaginable. You are the product of 66 million years of unceasing evolution, constant adaptation, improbable survival. And now, for the first time in all that history, there is a species capable of understanding what it means, capable of seeing past and future, capable of choosing what comes next. The question is not what was Earth after the dinosaurs. The question is what will Earth be after us? If this story has made you think, if it has amazed you, if it has given you a different perspective on the world around you, consider sharing it with someone else, because the stories we tell matter. The stories we transmit shape how we understand our place in the universe. And this is, perhaps, the most important story we can tell. The story of how a planet recovered from devastation. The story of how life, against all odds, persisted and thrived. The story of how we came to be what we are. The story of 66 million years of evolution, adaptation, extinction, and renewal that produced the world we know today. Your story. Our story. The story of all the mammals that came before and all that will come after. The story of Earth after the dinosaurs.